Before we descend into the darkness, I want to thank Aleem Fuzzy and so many others who suggested this story. Your ideas fuel these investigations into history's hidden corners. If you have suggestions for future stories, please leave them in the comments below. Who knows what we'll uncover next? They say the Earth keeps secrets. But what if those secrets are trying to speak? In 1943, while the world tore itself apart above ground, something beneath the soil began to hum. A frequency, a pattern, a message that would haunt American intelligence agencies for 4 decades and cost lives to keep buried. This is the story of Project Echo, a conspiracy that began with one man hearing voices in the dark and ended with proof that we are not alone beneath our feet. What you're about to read sounds impossible, but every historical anchor, every declassified document, every coincidental death, they're all real. The question isn't whether this happened. The question is, why are they still listening? Act 1. The Signal, 1943 to 1946. December 1943, Mammoth Cave, Kentucky. Lieutenant James Holloway had been underground for 6 hours, and the darkness was getting to him. The Army Signal Corps had sent him and his acoustic team into the deepest sections of Mammoth Cave with equipment that weighed nearly 300 pounds, hydrophones, seismographs, and the new electromagnetic sensors that were supposed to help them detect Nazi submarines through underwater sound channels. But this wasn't about submarines. Not really. "Sir, you need to hear this," Corporal Eddie Chen called from the makeshift station they'd erected near the frozen Niagara Formation. His voice echoed strangely in the limestone chamber, distorted by the cave's natural acoustics. Holloway made his way across the uneven floor, his flashlight beam cutting through the absolute blackness. Chen was hunched over the oscilloscope, his face pale in the green glow of the screen. "What am I looking at?" Holloway asked. "That's just it, sir." "I don't know." Chen pointed to the readout. "We've been picking up this frequency for the past 20 minutes. 18 hertz, subsonic, below the range of human hearing, but the equipment's catching it clear as day." Holloway frowned. 18 hertz was in the infrasound range, the frequency that could make people feel uneasy, anxious, even terrified without knowing why. Churches had been built with organ pipes that produced similar frequencies, supposedly to create a sense of religious awe, but this was different. "Seismic activity," he suggested. "No, sir." Wrong signature entirely. Earthquakes produce a broad spectrum. This is... Chen adjusted the gain on the oscilloscope. "This is precise. Too precise. And it's modulated." "Modulated how?" "Like Morse code, sir, but not quite. There's a pattern. Every 3.7 seconds the frequency dips and rises, then repeats. It's been doing it for 20 minutes without variation." Holloway felt something cold settle in his stomach. Natural phenomena didn't repeat with mechanical precision. "Source direction?" Chen swallowed hard. "That's the problem, sir. According to our equipment, it's coming from below us, approximately 2,000 feet below us." "That's impossible. We're already 600 feet underground." "Yes, sir, I know." They stared at each other in the green light, listening to the absolute silence of the cave. But now, knowing what the equipment was detecting, Holloway could almost feel it. A pressure in his chest, a vibration at the edge of perception. "Pack it up," Holloway said quietly. "We're taking this back to Fort Meade." And Chen, "Sir, don't mention this to anyone outside the team. That's an order." January 1944, Fort Meade, Maryland. The report sat on Colonel Theodore Crane's desk for 3 days before he read it. When he finally did, he read it twice, then locked it in his safe and made a phone call to Washington. Within a week, Project Echo was born. The official designation was Acoustic Intelligence Division Special Research Unit. The official mission was to develop better submarine detection technology. The unofficial mission was to figure out what the hell was making that sound beneath Kentucky, and whether the Germans had somehow built an installation under American soil. Crane assembled a team: geologists, physicists, acoustic engineers, and one very unusual consultant, a machinist from Pennsylvania named Richard Sharp Shaver. Shaver was thin, intense, and completely convinced that he could hear voices through metal. He'd been sending letters to the War Department for months, claiming that when he worked with his welding equipment, the metal would speak to him, transmitting messages about underground civilizations and advanced weapon systems. Most of the brass thought he was insane. But Crane had read those letters carefully. Shaver described hearing low-frequency transmissions, electromagnetic interference, and subsonic pulses, all the things that Holloway's team had detected in Mammoth Cave. "Mr. Shaver," Crane said when they met in a windowless room at Fort Meade, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Can you hear sounds that other people can't?" Shaver's eyes were bright, feverish. "I can hear them right now, Colonel. Through the walls, through the floor. They're always there, underneath everything. Most people just don't know how to listen." "What do they say?" "They're not saying anything. Not in English, anyway. So it's more like instructions, technical specifications. I've tried to write it all down, but it comes too fast." He pulled a worn notebook from his jacket. "I think someone's down there, deep down, and I think they're trying to warn us." Crane took the notebook. The pages were filled with diagrams, equations, and strange linguistic symbols that looked almost like ancient hieroglyphics. But scattered among the apparent madness were acoustic formulas that were technically sound, electromagnetic field calculations that matched classified research, and geological cross-sections that showed remarkable accuracy. "Mr. Shaver, how much do you know about subsurface geology?" "Nothing, sir. I'm a machinist." "Then where did you learn this?" Crane pointed to a detailed diagram showing limestone cavern systems beneath the Appalachian mountain range. Systems that matched classified USGS surveys that Shaver couldn't possibly have accessed. Shaver leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I told you, Colonel. They told me, the ones below. They call themselves the Tero, and they say there are others down there too. Bad ones. They call them the Dero, the detrimental robots, abandoned machines from an ancient race that are still active, still functional, still broadcasting." Crane closed the notebook slowly. Either Richard Shaver was the most elaborate hoaxer in American history, or he was detecting something real, something that was about to become a matter of national security. "Mr. Shaver, how would you like to work for the United States Army?" March of 1945, Acoustic Intelligence Division, Underground Research Facility. Over the next year, Project Echo expanded rapidly. They installed listening stations in caves across Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. They recruited academic geophysicists under the guise of mineral surveys. They developed more sensitive equipment capable of detecting electromagnetic anomalies through solid rock. And they found more signals. The 18 Hz hum wasn't isolated to Mammoth Cave. It appeared in Luray Caverns, Virginia, in Cumberland Caverns, Tennessee, in Carlsbad Caverns, New Mexico. Always deep, always precise, always modulated in the same pattern. Lieutenant Holloway, now promoted to captain and leading the field research teams, stood in the operations centre studying the map of North America that now bristled with red pins marking detection sites. "It's a network," he said to Colonel Crane. "Look at the pattern. These aren't random. They form geometric relationships, triangulation points." Crane studied the map. Holloway was right. Connected the detection sites and you got a series of overlapping triangles, all pointing toward three central locations: Mount Shasta in California, the Four Corners region of the Southwest, and somewhere beneath the Appalachian Mountains. "What are they pointing at?" Crane asked. "I don't know yet, sir." But Shaver had an idea. "He thinks they're not transmitting to us. He thinks they're transmitting to each other. Communications? Navigation, maybe, or some kind of monitoring system." He compared it to the way submarine hydrophones triangulate position. If these signals are emanating from deep facilities, they might be using the Earth's crust itself as a transmission medium. Crane was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened a locked file cabinet and removed a folder marked Eyes Only, Crater Classification. "What I'm about to show you doesn't leave this room," Crane said. 3 weeks ago we broke a German cipher transmission. It was incomplete, corrupted, but we got enough. The Nazis were conducting similar research. They called it Ahnenerbe Section Bergwerk, the Ancestral Heritage Mining Section. They were looking for what they called Urtechnology, pre-human technology. He laid out several photographs, aerial reconnaissance of German mountain facilities in Bavaria, partially destroyed by Allied bombing. Among the ruins were exposed tunnel entrances, descending at impossible angles into solid rock. Tunnels were too smooth, too regular to be natural formation. We think Hitler was searching for underground weapons facilities left by some ancient civilization. We thought it was occult nonsense. But now... Crane gestured at the map with its constellation of red pins. Now I'm not so sure... Holloway felt his mouth go dry. Sir, are you saying that the Germans might have found something? I'm saying that in April of last year all German transmissions from their Bavarian research sites went silent. Not destroyed. Silent. The last message we intercepted was a single word, repeated 17 times. Hören, German for listen. The two men stared at each other in the fluorescent light of the operations centre, both thinking the same impossible thought. Sir, Holloway said slowly, what if the signal in Kentucky wasn't trying to reach us? What if it was responding to something the Germans activated? Crane picked up the phone on his desk. Get me the Office of Strategic Services, priority clearance. Tell them we need to talk about what we found in Germany. The war in Europe was almost over, but something else, something far older, was just beginning. Act 2. The Shaver Files, 1946 to 1952. June 1946, Chicago, Illinois. Ray Palmer was having the best year of his career, and it was making him deeply nervous. As editor of Amazing Stories magazine, he'd published Richard Shaver's accounts of underground civilizations for the past year. The Shaver Mystery Series. Sales had exploded. Every issue sold out. They were getting thousands of letters from readers claiming they too could hear the voices, that they too had encountered evidence of the underground world. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like being watched. Palmer sat in his cramped office above the print shop, staring at the letter that had arrived that morning. No return address. Postmarked Washington, District of Columbia. Inside was a single typed sentence. You are disclosing classified research under the guise of fiction. Cease publication or face federal investigation. Palmer lit a cigarette with shaking hands. He'd suspected for months that Shaver's stories were more than just imagination. The technical details were too accurate. The geological descriptions matched real cave systems. And there were the phone calls, anonymous, threatening, always late at night. A knock at the door made him jump. "It's open," he called, trying to keep his voice steady. A man entered, tall and grey-suited, with the kind of neutral face that you forgot immediately after seeing it. He carried a leather briefcase and moved with the careful precision of someone used to being in control. "Mr. Palmer," the man said, not offering his hand. "My name is Robert A. Marsh. I'm a geophysicist with the Army Corps of Engineers." "I don't need any engineering work done," Palmer said, trying for humour and failing. Marsh closed the door behind him. "No, but you need to see something before they make you stop publishing." He opened the briefcase and removed a small black canister. From it he extracted several strips of microfilm and laid them on Palmer's desk. "What is this?" Palmer asked. "Insurance," Marsh said, "and proof." "Look at them." Palmer held the first strip up to the light. It showed a technical diagram, tunnel systems, geometric and precise, cutting through layers of geological strata. At the top of the schematic, in neat military lettering, Terro Access, Point 7A, Mount Shasta Sector. Palmer's hands went numb. Terro. The name Shaver had used for the benevolent underground race in his stories. How? Palmer couldn't finish the sentence. "Your friend Mr. Shaver wasn't making it up," Marsh said quietly. "He was describing classified military surveys. We've known about deep-level anomalies since 1943. The Army has been mapping them, and now certain elements within the government want the whole thing buried, literally and figuratively. Why are you showing me this?" Because I think the public has a right to know, and because I'm part of a group within the service who believes that what's down there isn't a threat. It's a resource, maybe even a lifeline. But the intelligence agencies are moving to suppress everything. They're going to shut you down, Palmer. But if you move fast, you can get the truth out first. Palmer shuffled through the microfilm strips. There were dozens, cross-sections of underground facilities beneath Mount Shasta, the San Luis Valley in Colorado, a place called Dulce, New Mexico. The diagrams showed massive chambers, kilometers deep, with notations about electromagnetic anomalies and structural composition that didn't match known geology. "Why me?" Palmer asked. Marsh smiled slightly. "Because you've already been telling the truth disguised as fiction. Keep doing that. Just make sure these images get published. Let people see what their government is hiding." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing. There's a reason they're called Tero and Darrow in the old texts. It's not made up. It's a military abbreviation. Technical research operations and detrimental research operations. The good ones and the bad ones. The question isn't whether they exist. The question is, which ones did we wake up?" Marsh left, and Palmer sat alone with the microfilm, feeling the weight of something enormous settling onto his shoulders. He began planning the August 1948 issue immediately, the one that would change everything. August 1948. Palmer Publishing, Distribution Crisis. The issue never made it to the newsstands. Palmer had poured everything into it, reproductions of the microfilm images, a serialized exposé framed as speculative fiction, technical diagrams that matched Marsh's intelligence. 50,000 copies were printed, bound and loaded onto distribution trucks. Then came the phone call from the Office of Censorship. "Printing error," they said. "Every copy must be recalled and destroyed. National security matter. You'll be compensated for the loss." Palmer argued. He threatened to go public. He contacted lawyers. 2 days later, federal agents arrived at his office with a warrant. They confiscated the original microfilm, the photographic plates, the printing masters. The trucks returning from distribution were intercepted. All 50,000 copies were pulped. The official reason? Manufacturing defect in the binding adhesive poses a fire hazard. Palmer was ordered to sign a non-disclosure agreement. He refused. A week later, the IRS announced an audit of his publishing company going back 7 years. His bank accounts were frozen. His printer received threats of losing their federal contracts if they continued working with him. Palmer signed the agreement, but he'd kept one thing, a single proof copy of the cover, hidden in a safe deposit box in a bank across state lines. The cover art showed Mount Shasta split open, revealing geometric tunnels beneath. The tagline read, "The truth beneath our feet, a special investigation." He never saw Robert A. Marsh again. When Palmer tried to trace him through the Army Corps of Engineers, he was told no one by that name had ever worked there. Years later, Palmer would learn that Robert Marsh was a known alias used by the Central Intelligence Agency for covert domestic contacts. But by then, it didn't matter. The truth had been buried, and with it, any chance of warning people about what was coming next. Act 3, Operation Shaver, 1953 to 1958. April 1953, Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland. The program officially didn't exist. MKULTRA was born in the paranoid spring of 1953, and while most people would later associate it with LSD experiments and mind control, its earliest research focused on something more subtle, acoustic cognitive disruption. Major Robert Kellerman stood in the observation booth, watching through reinforced glass as the test subject. A volunteer soldier designated Subject 12 sat in the soundproof chamber below. The room was lined with speakers capable of producing frequencies from 5 Hz to 30,000 Hz, well below and above human hearing range. "Begin exposure," Kellerman ordered. The technician engaged the system. Subject 12 wouldn't hear anything. The frequency was 18 Hz, subsonic. But within seconds his behaviour changed. His breathing became rapid. He stood up, looking around the empty chamber with growing agitation. His hands began to shake. Heart rate increasing, the medical observer reported. 90 beats per minute, 100, 110. Subject 12 backed into a corner, his eyes wide with terror. He was experiencing what the researchers called infrasonic panic, the fight-or-flight response triggered not by any visible threat, but by an inaudible frequency. "Terminate exposure," Kellerman said. The frequency stopped. Within minutes, Subject 12's heart rate normalized. When questioned afterward, he reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread and presence, as if something malevolent was in the room with him. This wasn't new science, but what interested Kellerman was the source material for the research. A classified file labelled Acoustic Cognitive Disruption Subsurface Frequency Study, which referenced the Shaver letters from 1943. The working theory was elegant. Richard Shaver hadn't been insane. He'd been sensitive to low-frequency electromagnetic interference that most people couldn't consciously detect. The voices he heard were his brain's attempt to interpret subsonic signals as linguistic communication, a kind of auditory pareidolia, like seeing faces in clouds. But there was a problem with that theory. The signals were too organised. November 1956, Nevada test site. The monitoring station at Groom Range was temporary, erected to track seismic disturbances from the nuclear tests in the desert. But the equipment had picked up something that had nothing to do with atomic bombs. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Ashworth reviewed the data for the third time, hoping he'd misread it. He hadn't. "Tell me again what I'm looking at," he said to the technician, a young physicist named Bernard. "Subsonic transmission, sir. 18 Hz bass frequency with harmonic overtones. Has been cycling every 11 hours for the past 6 days. Source." Bernard pointed to the seismograph readout. "Beneath us, sir. Approximately 4,000 feet down. But here's the thing. The signal isn't constant. It's modulated, like Morse code. But the pattern doesn't match any known communication protocol." Ashworth felt a chill despite the desert heat outside. He'd heard rumours about the Shaver research. Most officers dismissed it as Cold War paranoia, the intelligence community chasing ghosts. But this? Could it be Soviet? He asked. "No, sir. The signal predates our tests here. We checked the archives. There are seismograph readings from this location going back to 1954 showing the same pattern, long before we established this facility." Ashworth picked up the phone and called Washington. Within hours, Operation Shaver was officially reactivated, and the Nevada site became ground zero for what would eventually become Area 51, though its purpose had nothing to do with aircraft. They were listening, and whatever was below, it was speaking. December 1958. Classified research memo. The memo that crossed CIA Director Alan Dulles' desk was brief and terrifying in its implications. Subject: Operation Shaver, Nevada Subsurface Analysis. Classification: Crater. Summary: Continuous monitoring of subsurface signals beneath Groom Range facility confirms artificial source. Signal characteristics inconsistent with Soviet technology or natural geological phenomena. Pattern analysis suggests encrypted communication using Earth's crust as transmission medium. Recommendation: expand monitoring to additional sites identified in 1943 Project Echo survey. Establish permanent underground listening facility. Designate operation highest classification level. Concern: if signals represent active pre-human technology as theorized, strategic implications require immediate executive briefing. Unknown capability level, unknown intent, unknown. Whether signals represent surveillance, communication, or targeting data. Addendum: Subject Richard Shaver, deceased October 1958. Cause: undetermined. Autopsy showed unusual calcification in auditory nerve tissue. Pathologist noted, "Never seen anything like this." Dulles initiated the executive briefing. The facility that would become Area 51 was authorised not to study flying saucers, but to monitor the voice of something far older, speaking from miles beneath the American desert. And the question that nobody could answer: was it talking to us or calling someone else? Act 4. The Phoenix Caves. 1962 to 1971. March 1962, Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado. The excavation of NORAD's underground command center was the most ambitious military construction project of the Cold War era. Tunneling into Cheyenne Mountain to create a nuclear-proof facility required moving millions of tons of granite, drilling through solid rock at depths that had never been attempted. And on March 17, 1962, the drill crew broke through into something impossible. Site engineer Thomas Rourke stood at the edge of the void, his flashlight beam disappearing into absolute darkness. The chamber they'd exposed was enormous, at least 200 feet in diameter, with walls that reflected light like polished metal. "Cut the drill," he ordered. The pneumatic shriek of the boring machine ceased, leaving only the sound of dripping water and the breathing of the 6-man crew. "What the hell is this?" Foreman Jack Lynch whispered. Rourke approached the wall, reaching out to touch it. The surface was smooth, seamless, and when he tapped it with his knuckle it rang like a bell, a pure, sustained tone that seemed to resonate through the rock itself. "This isn't natural," Rourke said. "Get the lights down here. All of them." And when they rigged the portable generators and flooded the chamber with light, the full scope of what they'd found became clear. The chamber wasn't just smooth, it was geometrically perfect. A sphere, carved or formed from the living rock, with a precision that seemed impossible. And leading away from it, both up and down into the darkness, were tunnels. Not carved roughly like mines, but machined. Their walls showed tool marks, but the marks were strange. Spiralling patterns like nothing Rourke had seen in 30 years of mining. Sir, look at this," one of the crew called from the far side of the chamber. Rourke made his way across the smooth floor. The man was pointing to a section of wall where the metal surface seemed to have cracked or corroded. Beneath it was another layer. Not rock, but something organic-looking, almost fossilized, with patterns that resembled circuitry or neural tissue. Rourke's hands were shaking as he took photographs. This was beyond his pay grade, beyond anyone's pay grade. "Nobody talks about this," he said to his crew. "Not to your families, not to other workers, not to anyone, understand?" They nodded, but Rourke could see the fear in their eyes. They all felt it. The same sensation that the test subjects in Edgewood had reported. The sense of presence, of being watched. 3 days later, 2 members of the crew, Michael Torres and James Beckman, volunteered for a survey mission deeper into the tunnel system. They descended on ropes with radio equipment and battery lamps, their voices crackling back to the surface team. "Tunnel extends at least 500 feet down," Torres reported. "The walls, they're warm. I can feel heat through my gloves." "Any sign of where it leads?" Rourke asked. "Negative, just keeps going." "Wait, static." "Sir, there's something down here. Some kind of..." The radio shrieked with feedback, a piercing whine that made everyone in the command tent rip off their headsets. When they got the channel clear, Torres and Beckman were gone. The rescue team that descended found their equipment, radios, lamps, rope harnesses, all neatly stacked at the bottom of the measured shaft. No bodies, no blood, no sign of struggle. But scratched into the metallic wall in letters 6 inches high was a single word in Spanish. Escucha. Listen. June 1963. Army Corps of Engineers report, classified. Subject: Cheyenne Mountain Anomaly, Subterranean Sector. PH3. Classification: Beyond Crater. Incident Summary. During excavation operations for NORAD facility, construction crews exposed pre-existing void system of apparent artificial origin. Subsequent exploration resulted in loss of 2 personnel under circumstances that remain unexplained. Structural analysis. Chamber walls demonstrate machined precision beyond current human capability. Material composition analysis shows layered structure inconsistent with natural geological formation. X-ray crystallography reveals organized metallic lattices suggesting manufactured origin. Geophysical assessment. Magnetic flux readings within chamber show anomalous variations, plus or minus 47 milligauss over 3-foot distances. EM spectrum analysis detects low-level radiation in ULF range, cycling at 18.07 Hz, identical to frequencies documented in Project Echo, 1943, and Operation Shaver, 1953-58. Recommendation: seal chamber and reroute excavation. Designate site as subterranean sector PH3 Phoenix 3. Limit access to crater-cleared personnel only. Addendum: recovered equipment from missing personnel shows unusual degradation. Radio components exhibit molecular restructuring consistent with exposure to intense electromagnetic fields. Rope fibers show protein denaturation typically seen in thermal decomposition, despite no evidence of heat exposure. Conclusion: structure predates human civilization. Origin and purpose unknown. Recommend establishment of continuous monitoring program and interdiction of any civilian archaeological interest in region. Final note: scratched message recovered from site escucha. Submitted for linguistic analysis. Word is Spanish for listen or hear, but usage suggests imperative form, a command or warning. The report was filed, classified beyond the highest levels, and the chamber was sealed behind 8 feet of reinforced concrete. NORAD was built over it, literally constructing America's nuclear command center on top of something that couldn't be explained or controlled. And deep in the sealed darkness, every 11 hours something continued to transmit. Act 4. The Quiet Years, 1972 to 1982. July 1975, Washington District of Columbia. When CIA Director William Colby testified before the Senate Select Committee about the Phoenix program in Vietnam, nobody noticed the single blacked-out paragraph in the middle of page 47. The paragraph was labelled PH3 Incident, Continuing, and the senators who had clearance to read the unredacted version never asked about it publicly. Those who did ask privately were told it referred to a separate matter of ongoing national security concern, unrelated to the Vietnam operations. But buried in the classified annexes was a memo from 1963, referencing Project Phoenix Caves and the discoveries at Cheyenne Mountain. The connection was deliberate. Someone wanted the Phoenix program testimony to serve as a breadcrumb, a hidden thread for future investigators to follow. That someone was likely Robert Kellerman, the Air Force major who'd overseen the early MKULTRA acoustic research and had been present at the Cheyenne Mountain excavation. He'd watched the government bury the truth for decades, and as he aged into retirement, his conscience had begun to trouble him. He couldn't tell the truth directly, but he could leave clues. November the 1980, United States Geological Survey, Western Regional Office. The seismic mapping program seemed routine, a federal survey using new deep harmonic resonance technology to map fault lines and mineral deposits across the western states. Geophysicist Karen Wu led the Mount Shasta survey team, installing a network of sensors to measure subsurface density and composition. The data they collected should have been mundane. Instead, it was impossible. "Run it again," Wu told her assistant, staring at the computer readout. "There has to be a calibration error." They ran it again, same results. Every 11 hours, precisely timed, a harmonic pulse emanated from a point approximately 9 miles beneath Mount Shasta. The frequency signature was mechanical, too regular, too precise to be seismic or volcanic. The pulse lasted exactly 17 seconds, then ceased. 11 hours later, it repeated. Wu cross-referenced the data with historical seismic records. The pattern had been present, unnoticed, in survey data going back to 1954. For 26 years, something deep beneath Mount Shasta had been broadcasting a signal, and nobody had been paying attention. She wrote up her findings and submitted them to USGS headquarters. 3 weeks later, her entire project was reclassified under Department of Energy jurisdiction, citing nuclear subsurface interest. All her data was confiscated, her team was disbanded, and she was reassigned to a desk job in Maryland, mapping earthquake risk in the Atlantic seaboard, about as far from Mount Shasta as she could get, while staying in the continental United States. But Wu kept copies. She always kept copies. March 1982, Colorado Springs, Colorado. Helen Worth had been an engineer at the Cheyenne Mountain facility for 19 years, long enough to earn the trust that came with institutional memory. She'd been there during the original construction, had heard the stories about the sealed chambers, had seen the classified reports that referenced non-human structural geometry. Now, dying of cancer with perhaps 6 months to live, she decided the truth mattered more than secrecy. She smuggled out photographs. Not many, just 3, taken during the brief window in 1963 before the Phoenix chamber was sealed. The images showed the metallic sphere that had been extracted from one of the branch tunnels, a perfect black orb approximately 3 feet in diameter, with a surface that seemed to absorb light. The photographs also captured the spectroscopic analysis results, showing an alloy composition that didn't match any terrestrial material. Some of the trace isotopes resembled samples from the Allende meteorite, others matched nothing in the reference database. Worth contacted a journalist, arranged a meeting, and prepared to testify about what the government had found beneath Cheyenne Mountain. She never made it to the meeting. On March 28, 1982, her car left the road on a clear, dry evening with perfect visibility. The crash site was examined by local police, who found no evidence of mechanical failure, no alcohol in her system, no reason for her to have lost control on a straight stretch of highway she'd driven 1,000 times. The photographs she'd stolen were never recovered. Her house was burgled the night of her death, but nothing was taken except a locked filing cabinet in her home office. The journalist who'd planned to meet her received an anonymous call the next day. A man's voice, calm and professional. Helen Worth died in a tragic accident. We know she contacted you. We know you're curious. Here's some advice. Stay curious about other things. The journalist took the advice. December 1982. Epilogue in the dark. Major Robert Kellerman, now retired, living in a modest house in Vermont, received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single photograph, the black sphere from Cheyenne Mountain, sitting on a laboratory bench. Written on the back in handwriting he recognised as Helen Worth's. They're listening to us. We should be listening back. Kellerman burned the photograph in his fireplace and poured himself a drink. He was 73 years old, and he'd kept the secret for 40 years. But the secret was bigger than him, bigger than all of them. The truth was simple and terrifying. In 1943, America had detected a signal from deep underground. In 1962, they'd found the source, or one of them. And for 40 years, the government had been trying to pretend it didn't exist. But existence doesn't require acknowledgement. The signal continued, regular as clockwork, every 11 hours. The chambers remained, sealed behind concrete and classification, and somewhere beneath Mount Shasta, beneath the Nevada desert, beneath the mountains of Colorado, something ancient and inexplicable was still active, still transmitting, still waiting. Epilogue, the document, present day. January 2024. National Archives, declassification release. The document appeared without fanfare in a routine declassification release, part of the ongoing process of making Cold War-era research papers available to the public. Most of the releases were mundane, budget reports, personnel files, mundane correspondence. But buried among them was a thin file labelled Project Echo, Acoustic Intelligence Division, Special Research Unit, 1943 to 1946. Graduate student Marcus Chen found it while researching his dissertation on World War II surveillance technology. At first, it seemed like exactly what it claimed to be, research into submarine detection using cave acoustics. But the final page caught his attention. It referenced a suppressed appendix designated Appendix R, subharmonic resonance signatures detected beneath continental shelf. The appendix itself was not included in the release. Instead, there was a note. Material continues to be classified under crater protocols. Expected declassification, 2043. 100 years. They were keeping it secret for 100 years. But the final line of the release document was visible, stamped in faded red ink. Source localization indeterminate. However, pattern repetition suggests intelligent modulation. Frequency, 18.07 Hz. Recommendation, continuous monitoring required. Chen stared at those words for a long time. Then he did what any good researcher would do. He started cross-referencing. He found Karen Wu's name in a 1980 USGS report about Mount Shasta seismic surveys, a report that had been partially redacted but was now available. He found references to Project Phoenix in declassified Air Force budget documents. He found Richard Shaver's letters in the FBI archives, complete with bureau notes dismissing them as the ravings of a paranoid schizophrenic. But he also found something else, a geophysics paper published just 6 months earlier by a team at Stanford University. They'd been studying naturally occurring infrasound in volcanic regions and had detected something unusual beneath Mount Shasta. A harmonic pulse, 18 hertz, repeating every 11 hours. The researchers had noted it as an unexplained geophysical phenomenon, possibly related to deep magma chamber resonance, but had recommended further study. Chen pulled up the raw data from their public research repository. The signal was still there, still broadcasting, still precise as a heartbeat. 81 years after Lieutenant Holloway first heard it in Mammoth Cave, the echo was still sounding. March 2024, Mount Shasta, California. Chen made the drive from Berkeley on a cloudy spring morning, bringing portable seismic monitoring equipment borrowed from the University Geology Department. He hiked to a remote location on the mountain's northern slope where the Stanford team had placed their sensors. He set up his equipment and waited. At exactly 2:47 p.m, his laptop screen lit up with activity. The seismograph showed a clear pulse, 18 hertz, subsonic, lasting 17 seconds. His electromagnetic field detector registered a corresponding spike, and his audio recorder, running through frequency shifting software to make the infrasound audible, captured something that made his skin crawl. It wasn't random. When shifted up into the audible range and played back, the pattern had structure, rhythm, almost like... Chen played it again, slowing it down, analysing the wave patterns. It was language, or something like language. A signal that carried information, repeating the same message over and over across decades, perhaps across centuries. He sat on the mountainside as the sun set, watching his equipment record cycle after cycle, the ancient transmission, still broadcasting from miles beneath his feet. And then Chen made a decision. He packed up his equipment, drove back to Berkeley, and wrote the most important paper of his life. He included everything. Project Echo, the Shaver letters, the Cheyenne Mountain discoveries, Karen Wu's data, and his own recordings. He cited every declassified document, every piece of evidence that was now part of the public record. He titled it, The Echo Below, Evidence for Subsurface Artificial Signal Transmission Beneath Western North America, 1943 to present. He submitted it to the Journal of Geophysical Research. It was rejected within 48 hours. Insufficient peer review of extraordinary claims. He submitted it to 3 more journals, all rejected. Finally, he posted it to the public preprint archive where anyone could read it for free. Within a week, it had been downloaded 50,000 times. Within a month, amateur researchers across the western United States were setting up monitoring stations. Within 6 months, the data was undeniable. The signal was real, it was artificial, and it had been broadcasting for at least 80 years. The government issued no comment, but funding for deep seismic research suddenly increased dramatically. New listening stations appeared near Mount Shasta, near the Four Corners region, near the Appalachian Mountains, all the places that Project Echo had identified in 1943. They were still listening, still trying to understand. The final truth. Here is what we know, stripped of speculation. In 1943, the United States military detected an artificial signal from deep underground. The signal was precise, repetitive, and unexplainable by natural geology. For 80 years, various agencies tried to understand, suppress, and contain this information. People died, careers were destroyed, documents were buried, but the signal never stopped. Today, with modern equipment and freed from Cold War secrecy, we can confirm that something beneath the western United States is transmitting. It has been transmitting since at least World War II. It may have been transmitting for thousands of years before that, waiting for someone with the right technology to listen. We don't know what it is. We don't know who built it. We don't know what the message says. But we know it's there. Richard Shaver wasn't crazy. The Terror and Error weren't fantasy. Project Echo wasn't paranoia. They were all pieces of a truth too large for any single conspiracy to contain. that beneath our feet in the deep places of the earth something is speaking, and now, finally, we're listening back. The question isn't whether the echo's real, and the question is, what happens when we learn what it's saying? And the even more terrifying question, what happens when it realizes we can finally hear it? This story is built on a foundation of real history. Richard S. Shaver was a real person who wrote to the government and to pulp magazines about underground civilizations. Project Echo and similar acoustic research programs existed during World War II. MKULTRA really did conduct acoustic warfare research. The Cheyenne Mountain facility really was built in the 1960s, and declassified documents do reference geological anomalies encountered during construction. The signal beneath Mount Shasta, the 18 Hz pulse broadcasting every 11 hours, that's where documented history ends and speculation begins. But here's what keeps me awake at night. In a 2019 geophysics paper, researchers really did detect an unexplained harmonic resonance beneath Mount Shasta. They called it a geological phenomenon and moved on. Maybe they were right. Or maybe, like Lieutenant Holloway in that Kentucky cave in 1943, they heard something real and chose not to ask the next question. The truth is often buried, but it's never silent. Keep listening. The static crackled through the shortwave radio as William Cooper's gravelly voice cut through the Arizona desert night. It was June 28th, 2001, and somewhere in the darkness of rural Eager, a man sat hunched over his microphone, delivering what would become one of the most chilling prophecies in modern conspiracy lore. "I'm telling you, be prepared for a major attack," Cooper warned his listeners on the hour of the time. "But it won't be Osama bin Laden. It will be those in our own government. They're going to blame it on bin Laden. But don't you believe it?" His words hung in the electromagnetic ether, absorbed by thousands of late-night listeners across America. Radio enthusiasts, conspiracy theorists, militia members, and curious insomniacs, all tuned in to hear what many considered the most dangerous voice in alternative media. Cooper's warnings about government deception, staged attacks, and the erosion of constitutional freedoms had made him a legend in underground circles. But just 4 months later, William Cooper would be dead, killed in a shootout that many believe wasn't what it seemed. His final broadcast, his prophetic warnings, and the circumstances of his death would cement his legacy as either a paranoid madman or a silenced prophet who got too close to the truth. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you think you know about conspiracy theories, government surveillance, and the price of speaking truth to power. This is the story of William Cooper, the man who warned us all and paid the ultimate price for it. Leave your video ideas in the comments below, and thank Andre for this incredible outline. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories if you enjoy these stories. Chapter 1. Who was William Cooper? William Milton Cooper entered this world on May 6, 1943, in a country still reeling from World War II. Born into a military family, young Bill seemed destined for a life of service and conformity. His father was a career Air Force officer, and the Cooper household moved frequently across military bases, instilling in Bill both a respect for authority and an intimate understanding of how military bureaucracy operated. After high school, Cooper followed the expected path, enlisting in the United States Navy in 1961. For the next 14 years he would serve his country with distinction, rising through the ranks and earning security clearances that would later form the foundation of his most controversial claims. By all accounts, Petty Officer Cooper was a model sailor, disciplined, intelligent, and fiercely patriotic. But something changed during his naval service. Cooper later claimed that between 1970 and 1973, while stationed in Vietnam, and later at various intelligence posts, he was assigned to briefing teams that exposed him to classified documents of the highest order. According to Cooper, these documents contained information that would shake the very foundations of reality as most Americans understood it. The files, Cooper alleged, detailed secret treaties between the United States government and extraterrestrial beings. They outlined plans for population control, weather modification, and the systematic dismantling of the Constitution. Most shocking of all, they reveal that a shadow government, what Cooper would later call the mystery schools, had been manipulating world events for centuries, orchestrating wars, economic collapses, and social upheaval to bring about a new world order. When Cooper left the Navy in 1975, he was a changed man. The clean-cut patriot who had enlisted in 1961 emerged as something far more complex, a man carrying secrets he claimed could topple governments and expose the greatest deception in human history. For more than a decade, he kept these revelations to himself, working various civilian jobs and trying to process what he had allegedly witnessed. It wasn't until the late 1980s that Cooper began speaking publicly about his experiences. At first, his lectures focused primarily on UFO cover-ups and alien government collaboration. The ufology community welcomed him with open arms. Here was an insider, a man with legitimate military credentials who could provide first-hand testimony about extraterrestrial contact. Cooper's early presentations were electrifying. He spoke with the authority of someone who had been there, seen the documents, and lived with the burden of cosmic secrets. His audiences hung on every word as he described alien bases, cattle mutilations conducted by government scientists, and secret space programs funded by black budgets. Unlike many UFO researchers who relied on second-hand accounts and fuzzy photographs, Cooper claimed direct knowledge. But Cooper's worldview was evolving. As the years passed, his focus began to shift from extraterrestrial threats to more earthbound conspiracies. He started connecting the dots between UFO secrecy and broader patterns of government deception. The aliens, he suggested, might not be the real enemy. They might be a convenient cover story for human conspirators seeking to implement global tyranny. This evolution in Cooper's thinking culminated in 1991 with the publication of Behold a Pale Horse, a sprawling nearly 500-page tome that would become one of the most influential conspiracy books ever written. The title came from the biblical book of Revelation, and I looked, and behold a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. Behold a Pale Horse was unlike anything that had come before in conspiracy literature. Cooper didn't just focus on one theory or cover-up, he connected everything. UFOs, the Kennedy assassination, the Illuminati, FEMA camps, AIDS as a bioweapon, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which Cooper later admitted were fabricated, mind control experiments, and plans for population reduction were all woven together into a comprehensive narrative of systematic deception and control. The book's impact was immediate and profound. It flew off the shelves of independent bookstores, was passed hand to hand in militia camps, and became required reading for anyone seeking to understand the real forces shaping world events. Cooper had achieved something remarkable. He had created a unified field theory of conspiracy that could explain virtually any disturbing event or troubling trend. More importantly, Cooper had established himself as the godfather of modern conspiracies. His work influenced a generation of researchers, broadcasters, and activists who would carry his ideas into the internet age. Names like Alex Jones, David Icke, and countless others would build upon the foundation Cooper had laid, but few would match his combination of military credibility, comprehensive worldview, and uncompromising dedication to what he saw as truth. Yet for all his influence, Cooper remained something of an outsider even within conspiracy circles. He was too radical for mainstream UFO researchers, too focused on aliens for traditional political conspiracy theorists, and too uncompromising for anyone seeking middle ground. This isolation would only intensify as Cooper transitioned from author to broadcaster, using the power of shortwave radio to spread his message to an ever-growing audience of believers and seekers. By the mid-1990s, William Cooper had become exactly what he claimed the government feared most: an informed citizen who refused to be silenced, armed with knowledge that challenged the very legitimacy of those in power. The stage was set for a confrontation that would ultimately cost him his life, but would ensure his message lived on long after his death. The man who had started as a naval petty officer had transformed himself into something far more dangerous in the eyes of authority. A prophet of resistance, a voice of warning, and a symbol of what happens when someone gets too close to truths that powerful people want to keep hidden. Chapter 2. A Dangerous Man. By 1993, William Cooper had discovered the perfect medium for his message: shortwave radio. From his remote compound in Egar, Arizona, nestled in the White Mountains near the New Mexico border, Cooper launched the Hour of the Time, a nightly broadcast that would make him the most influential voice in American conspiracy circles, and, according to federal authorities, one of the most dangerous men in the country. The choice of shortwave was deliberate and symbolic. Unlike AM or FM radio, shortwave signals could travel vast distances, bouncing off the ionosphere to reach listeners across continents. More importantly, shortwave existed largely outside the regulatory reach of federal agencies. It was the perfect platform for a man who saw the government as an illegitimate occupying force bent on enslaving the American people. Cooper's broadcast setup was surprisingly sophisticated for a one-man operation in rural Arizona. His studio was equipped with professional-grade equipment, multiple transmitters, and backup power systems. He treated his show with the seriousness of a network television production, complete with opening music, commercial breaks filled with his own commentary, and a rigid schedule that his listeners could depend on. But it was Cooper's content that truly set him apart from other alternative broadcasters. While many shortwave hosts focused on single issues, gold prices, religious prophecy, or political commentary, Cooper offered a comprehensive worldview that connected every major event to an overarching conspiracy. Nothing happened by accident in Cooper's universe. Every terrorist attack, economic downturn, natural disaster, or political scandal was part of a carefully orchestrated plan to bring about global government under the control of ancient mystery schools and secret societies. His typical broadcast would begin with current events, which Cooper would dissect through his conspiratorial lens. A school shooting wasn't just a tragedy. It was a false flag operation designed to justify gun confiscation. A new environmental regulation wasn't an attempt to protect nature. It was part of a plan to control human movement and economic activity. A celebrity death wasn't an accident or natural occurrence. It was a ritual sacrifice by occult elites maintaining their power through blood offerings. What made Cooper particularly compelling was his presentation style. Unlike the often manic delivery of other conspiracy broadcasters, Cooper spoke with calm authority. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen behind the curtain, who possessed knowledge that lesser minds couldn't comprehend. He frequently reminded his audience of his military background, his security clearances, and his access to classified information, lending credibility to even his most outlandish claims. Cooper was also remarkably well read for a conspiracy theorist. His broadcasts were peppered with references to historical documents, philosophical treatises, and obscure academic works. He encouraged his listeners to do their own research, often spending entire shows reading primary source documents on the air. This scholarly approach distinguished him from broadcasters who relied primarily on speculation and rumour. But perhaps most significantly, Cooper positioned himself as the ultimate arbiter of conspiratorial truth. He didn't just expose the New World Order, he exposed the other conspiracy researchers who he claimed were working for the enemy. Alex Jones, David Icke, and virtually every other prominent figure in the movement found themselves targeted by Cooper's devastating critiques. 99% of the people in the so-called Patriot movement are either controlled opposition or useful idiots, Cooper would declare. They put out just enough truth to gain your trust, then lead you down the wrong path when it matters most. Cooper's attacks on fellow conspiracy theorists were particularly brutal. He accused Alex Jones of being a CIA asset, whose job was to make conspiracy theorists look crazy. He dismissed UFO researchers as government disinformation agents, spreading false stories to cover up more mundane but equally sinister activities. He even turned against his former colleagues in the militia movement, claiming they had been infiltrated and compromised by federal agents. This paranoid perfectionism made Cooper enemies throughout the alternative media world, but it also enhanced his reputation among true believers. If Cooper was willing to attack his own allies for being insufficiently pure, surely his commitment to truth was absolute. His isolation became a badge of honour, proof that he alone remained uncorrupted by the forces seeking to mislead the American people. Cooper's radio show wasn't just entertainment or information, it was a form of resistance. He regularly encouraged his listeners to withdraw from the federal system entirely. He advocated for refusing to pay income taxes, removing children from public schools, avoiding social security numbers, and preparing for armed resistance against government tyranny. The IRS has no legal authority to collect taxes from American citizens, Cooper would thunder. The Federal Reserve is a private corporation stealing from the American people. The entire federal government is operating outside the Constitution and has no legitimacy whatsoever. These weren't just abstract political positions for Cooper, they were personal commitments. In the mid-1990s, he stopped filing tax returns and began declaring his Arizona property sovereign territory outside the jurisdiction of federal and state authorities. He stockpiled weapons, food and supplies, preparing for what he saw as an inevitable confrontation with government agents. Cooper's compound became a fortress. Security cameras monitored all approaches. Motion sensors and alarms covered the perimeter. Multiple weapons caches were strategically positioned throughout the property. Cooper rarely left his mountain retreat, and when he did, he travelled heavily armed and hyper-vigilant for surveillance or attack. This militant preparation wasn't driven by general paranoia. Cooper had specific reasons to believe he was being targeted. His FBI file, later released through Freedom of Information Act requests, revealed extensive surveillance dating back to the early 1990s. Federal agents monitored his broadcasts, infiltrated his lectures, and tracked his financial activities. They classified him as a militia extremist and potential domestic terrorist, despite the fact that Cooper never advocated initiating violence against anyone. The government's concern was understandable from their perspective. Cooper's influence was growing exponentially. His books were bestsellers in alternative circles. His radio show attracted hundreds of thousands of regular listeners. His lectures drew packed audiences across the country. Most dangerously, his message was inspiring others to take action. Militia groups cited Cooper's work as justification for their activities. Tax resistors used his arguments in court cases. Survivalists and separatists quoted his warnings about coming persecution. Cooper seemed to relish his status as public enemy number one. He frequently read portions of his FBI file on the air, mocking federal agents as jackbooted thugs and traitors to the Constitution. He would often interrupt his regular programming to report suspicious activities around his property. Unmarked helicopters, strange vehicles or unusual electronic interference that he attributed to government monitoring. "They want to kill me," Cooper would tell his audience matter-of-factly. "They're going to make it look like I started trouble, like I shot first, like I was a dangerous criminal who had to be stopped. But I'm telling you right now, if I die, it won't be because I initiated violence. It will be because I told the truth they can't allow to be heard." These warnings became more frequent and specific as the 1990s progressed. Cooper seemed to sense that his time was running out, that the forces he had spent years exposing were finally moving to silence him permanently. He began making detailed predictions about how his death would be staged, what justifications would be used, and how the media would portray him after he was gone. To his followers, these prophecies would prove to be his most accurate predictions of all. To skeptics, they seemed like the paranoid fantasies of a man whose grip on reality was slipping. But everyone agreed on one thing. William Cooper had made himself the most dangerous enemy of the federal government, and that rarely ended well for the individual involved. The stage was set for a final confrontation, but first, Cooper would deliver one more prophecy that would cement his reputation as either a madman or a prophet. On that fateful night in June 2001, he would make a prediction so specific and accurate that it would seem to prove everything he had been saying for years about false flag operations and government deception. Chapter 3. The Prophecy Before 9/11. The summer of 2001 was a strange time in America. The country was enjoying unprecedented prosperity, the internet was transforming daily life, and most citizens felt secure in their bubble of comfort and normalcy. But in the remote mountains of Arizona, William Cooper was sensing something ominous on the horizon. Cooper's shortwave radio broadcasts had taken on an increasingly urgent tone throughout the spring and early summer of 2001. He spoke repeatedly about impending catalyzing events that would be used to justify the implementation of martial law and the final destruction of constitutional government in America. His sources, which he claimed included active military personnel, intelligence operatives, and well-placed government insiders, were all reporting the same thing. Something big was coming, and it would change everything. It was during his June 28, 2001 broadcast that Cooper made the prediction that would define his legacy. Speaking with his characteristic calm authority, he delivered what would become one of the most chilling prophecies in the history of conspiracy theory. Whatever is going to happen that they're going to blame on Osama bin Laden, don't you even believe it, Cooper warned his listeners. They will soon do something outrageous to gain the support of the American people, allowing them to do whatever they want to do. Watch for a major attack on American soil. They will use this to unite the American people behind their New World Order agenda. Cooper's warning wasn't a vague prediction about future troubles. It was specific, detailed, and time-sensitive. He told his audience that the attack would happen soon, that it would be blamed on bin Laden, and that it would be used to justify unprecedented expansions of government power. He urged his listeners to remember his words when the event occurred, because the media would immediately begin promoting the official narrative without asking the crucial questions about who really benefited from the attack. Osama bin Laden is a CIA asset, Cooper explained. He's been working with American intelligence for decades. When they're ready to use him as a patsy, they'll activate him for one final operation. But don't think for a moment that he's actually the mastermind. The real architects of this operation sit in Washington, not in some cave in Afghanistan. Cooper's analysis was based on his understanding of what intelligence professionals call false flag operations, attacks carried out by one group but designed to appear as if they were perpetrated by someone else. He had studied the history of such operations extensively, from the Reichstag fire that brought the Nazis to power, to the Gulf of Tonkin incident that escalated American involvement in Vietnam, to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing that Cooper claimed was orchestrated by federal agents. According to Cooper's worldview, false flag operations were the preferred method of the shadow government for advancing their agenda. Rather than trying to convince the American people to voluntarily surrender their freedoms, it was much more effective to stage dramatic attacks that would make citizens beg for protection, even at the cost of their constitutional rights. Cooper's June 28th broadcast wasn't the only time he warned about the impending attack. Throughout July and August 2001, he continued to sound the alarm, providing additional details and context. He predicted that the attack would target high-profile buildings in major American cities, that it would involve hijacked aircraft, and that the death toll would be massive enough to traumatize the entire nation. They need body count, Cooper explained grimly. The more Americans who die, the more outrage they can generate. They need the American people to be so angry and afraid that they'll support any military action, any new law, any expansion of government power that's presented as necessary for their safety. Cooper also predicted the specific ways the attack would be used to advance the New World Order agenda. He warned that it would lead to massive new surveillance programs that would monitor every American citizen. He predicted that it would justify invasions of multiple countries in the Middle East, regardless of their actual connection to the attack. He foresaw the creation of new government agencies with unprecedented powers to detain and interrogate American citizens without due process. Most chillingly, Cooper predicted that the attack would mark the beginning of an endless war on terror that would never actually end because it couldn't end. Its real purpose wasn't to defeat terrorism, but to create a permanent state of emergency that would allow the shadow government to complete their transformation of America from a constitutional republic into a totalitarian surveillance state. These predictions were so specific and so far-reaching that many of Cooper's regular listeners found them hard to believe. Even in conspiracy circles, there were limits to what seemed credible, and Cooper appeared to be pushing beyond those limits. Some wondered if the isolation and stress of his lifestyle were finally taking their toll on his mental state. But Cooper's warnings weren't based on paranoid fantasy. They were grounded in his systematic study of historical patterns and his understanding of how power actually operates behind the scenes. He had spent years documenting the techniques used by governments to manipulate public opinion and justify expansions of their authority. The coming attack would simply be the largest and most successful implementation of these time-tested methods. When Cooper signed off on the evening of June 28, 2001, his regular listeners settled back into their daily routines, filing his predictions away in their minds, alongside his other warnings about coming persecution and government tyranny. Most assumed they would have months or even years to prepare for whatever Cooper was predicting. None of them imagined that in just over 2 months, they would be watching the Twin Towers collapse on live television, while remembering every word of Cooper's prophetic warning. September 11th, 2001 dawned clear and beautiful across the eastern United States. In Arizona, William Cooper was preparing for his regular morning routine when the first reports began coming in about a plane hitting the World Trade Center. Like millions of Americans, he initially assumed it was a tragic accident, until the second plane hit, and then the Pentagon, and then United 93 crashed in Pennsylvania. As Cooper watched the attacks unfold on television, his reaction was unlike that of most Americans. While the country was experiencing shock, grief and confusion, Cooper felt a grim satisfaction that his predictions had proven accurate. Everything was happening exactly as he had warned. The massive death toll, the spectacular visuals designed for maximum psychological impact, the immediate focus on Osama bin Laden as the mastermind, and the calls for unity behind whatever response the government deemed necessary. Within hours of the attacks, Cooper was back on the air, reminding his listeners of his June 28th warning and providing real-time analysis of how the events were being used to implement the pre-planned agenda he had exposed months earlier. His audience, stunned by the accuracy of his predictions, began spreading the word throughout alternative media circles. William Cooper, the man who had been dismissed as a paranoid conspiracy theorist, had just made the most accurate prediction in the history of alternative media. In the days and weeks following 9/11, as the government rolled out exactly the surveillance programs, military interventions and expansions of executive power that Cooper had predicted, his credibility reached unprecedented heights. But Cooper's moment of vindication would also seal his fate. If he had been dangerous to the establishment before 9/11, he was now absolutely lethal. His accurate prediction proved that he had access to genuine inside information about government operations. His growing influence proved that his message was resonating with an ever-expanding audience. His uncompromising hostility proved that he would never be co-opted or silenced voluntarily. For William Cooper, being right about 9/11 wasn't a victory, it was a death sentence. The same forces he had spent years exposing now had to eliminate him before he could cause even more damage to their carefully constructed narrative. The countdown to his final confrontation had begun. Chapter 4, November the 5th, 2001. The autumn air was crisp in the White Mountains of Arizona as November settled over William Cooper's fortified compound. It had been nearly 2 months since the September 11th attacks, and Cooper's influence had never been greater. His accurate prediction had transformed him from a marginalised conspiracy theorist into a prophetic voice that commanded respect even among skeptics. His shortwave broadcasts were reaching record audiences, his website traffic had exploded, and his books were flying off the shelves as Americans searched for explanations that made sense of their transformed world. But Cooper's vindication had come at a price. His FBI file, already thick with surveillance reports and threat assessments, was growing daily. Federal agents were monitoring his every broadcast, analysing his every statement and tracking his every movement. The man who had accurately predicted the most devastating attack in American history was now seen as a clear and present danger to national security. Cooper seemed to sense that his time was running out. His broadcasts throughout October had taken on an increasingly urgent tone, as if he were racing against time to deliver his complete message before being silenced. He spent entire shows reading his will on the air, making detailed arrangements for the continuation of his work after his death, and providing specific instructions to his followers about how to respond if he were killed. "I will not commit suicide," Cooper declared repeatedly during his final broadcasts. "I will not die in a car accident. I will not die of a heart attack or drug overdose. If any of these things happen to me, you will know that I was murdered by agents of the federal government. They will try to make it look accidental or justifiable, but you must not believe their lies." Cooper's paranoia was well-founded. Federal authorities had indeed been developing plans to neutralise what they saw as an increasingly dangerous domestic terrorist. His accurate prediction about 9/11 had elevated him from a routine surveillance target to an active threat requiring immediate action. The question wasn't whether to move against Cooper, but when and how to do it in a way that wouldn't create a martyr or validate his conspiracy theories. The opportunity came through what appeared to be a completely unrelated incident. Earlier in 2001, Cooper had been involved in a confrontation with several teenagers who had allegedly trespassed on his property. According to the official report, Cooper had brandished a weapon and threatened the youths, leading to charges of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. A warrant for his arrest had been issued, but Navajo County Sheriff's deputies had been reluctant to serve it, knowing Cooper's reputation and the likelihood of violent resistance. The warrant sat on a desk for months while authorities debated the best approach. Some advocated for a daylight raid with overwhelming force. Others suggested attempting to arrest Cooper away from his compound when he made one of his rare trips to town. A few even proposed negotiating his surrender through intermediaries who might be able to reason with him. But by early November 2001, the decision had been made at levels far above the local sheriff's office. William Cooper had become too dangerous to remain free, and the aggravated assault warrant provided the perfect legal justification for taking him down. Unlike the federal charges that might have been brought for his tax resistance or anti-government activities, a simple state criminal warrant appeared routine and non-political. The plan that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. Deputies would conduct a nighttime raid on Cooper's compound, ostensibly to serve the assault warrant. Cooper would resist, as everyone knew he would, and in the ensuing gunfight, he would be killed in what appeared to be a justified use of deadly force. No conspiracy theories, no martyrdom, no questions about government overreach. Just a dangerous criminal who chose to shoot it out with law enforcement rather than face justice in court. The operation was scheduled for the evening of November 5th, 2001, Guy Fawkes Day, though this symbolic date was likely coincidental. Sheriff's deputies conducted surveillance of the compound throughout the day, noting Cooper's movements and the defensive preparations he had made over the years. The approach routes were mapped, contingency plans were developed, and rules of engagement were established. What happened next depends entirely on whose account you believe. According to the official version released by the Navajo County Sheriff's Office, Deputies approached Cooper's residence at approximately 11:40 p.m. to serve the outstanding warrant. Cooper was outside his home when the deputies arrived and immediately opened fire on the officers without warning. Deputy Robert Marinez was struck in the head by Cooper's initial shots, but managed to return fire along with other deputies. Cooper was hit multiple times and died at the scene. The entire firefight lasted less than 2 minutes. The official narrative was clean, simple, and legally bulletproof. A dangerous criminal had resisted arrest and paid the ultimate price for his poor judgment. Deputy Marinez survived his wounds, and no other officers were injured. The warrant was legitimate, the operation was conducted by the book, and the use of deadly force was entirely justified under Arizona law. But Cooper's supporters immediately noted the inconsistencies in the official story. Why was a high-risk arrest attempted at night when it could have been done safely during daylight hours? Why weren't less lethal alternatives attempted before resorting to deadly force? Why was Cooper, who was known to be intelligent and tactical, standing outside his home in the open where he would be vulnerable? Why did he allegedly fire first when he had spent years warning his listeners that he would be set up in exactly this scenario? The inconsistencies multiplied as more details emerged. Witnesses reported hearing automatic weapons fire, though deputies claimed to have used only standard service weapons. The crime scene was processed by federal agents rather than local investigators, despite this being a county-level arrest warrant. Cooper's computer equipment and broadcasting gear were seized as evidence, though they had no relevance to an aggravated assault case from months earlier. Most suspicious of all was the timing. Cooper had spent years predicting that the government would move against him immediately after a major false flag operation, when his credibility was at its peak and his influence was growing. His death coming just 8 weeks after the 9/11 attacks he had specifically predicted would be blamed on bin Laden, seemed to validate his most paranoid warnings. Cooper's final broadcast had aired just hours before the raid. In it, he had seemed unusually reflective, almost melancholy, as if he sensed what was coming. He spoke about his love for America, his commitment to the Constitution, and his hope that his work would inspire others to continue the fight for freedom after he was gone. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe, Cooper had said, quoting Nietzsche. If you try it, you'll often be lonely, and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. Those would be William Cooper's last public words. By dawn on November the 6th, 2001, the voice that had warned America about the coming police state had been permanently silenced. The man who had predicted his own death had been proven right one final time. The mainstream media coverage of Cooper's death was minimal and dismissive. Most news outlets portrayed him as a deranged conspiracy theorist who had finally gotten himself killed through his own extremism. There was little investigation into the circumstances of the shooting, no questions about why the arrest had been conducted at night, and no mention of Cooper's accurate prediction about September 11th. But in alternative media circles, Cooper's death was seen as confirmation of everything he had taught. The government had eliminated him exactly as he had predicted, using exactly the methods he had described. His martyrdom transformed him from a controversial broadcaster into a legend of resistance against tyranny. The man who had spent years warning about government assassination programs had become their latest victim. The voice that had tried to wake up America to the dangers of the emerging police state had been silenced at precisely the moment when his warnings were proving most accurate. William Cooper was dead, but his message was about to reach a much larger audience than it had ever reached while he was alive. Chapter 5: Aftermath and Legacy. The news of William Cooper's death spread rapidly through the interconnected networks of shortwave radio listeners, internet forums, and alternative media outlets that had formed his primary audience. Within hours of the shooting, Cooper's supporters were sharing their own recordings of his broadcasts, analysing the official story for inconsistencies, and developing theories about who had really ordered his elimination. The immediate aftermath was telling in its stark contrasts. Mainstream media outlets that covered Cooper's death at all portrayed him as a dangerous extremist whose violent end was both predictable and justified. Law enforcement officials praised the professionalism of the deputies involved and emphasised that Cooper's death could have been avoided if he had simply surrendered peacefully. But in the alternative media ecosystem that Cooper had helped create, his death was interpreted as the ultimate validation of his teachings. Here was a man who had accurately predicted the 9/11 attacks, warned that the government would use them to implement a police state, and promised that truth-tellers would be systematically eliminated. His death, just weeks after his most dramatic vindication, seemed to prove that he had been right about everything. Cooper's widow Annie faced an immediate crisis. The family's primary source of income had been eliminated overnight, and federal authorities had seized much of Cooper's equipment and broadcasting infrastructure as evidence in the shooting investigation. More importantly, she had to decide whether to continue her husband's work or let his message die with him. Annie Cooper chose to honour her husband's memory by keeping his legacy alive. She worked with Cooper's longtime supporters to preserve his broadcasts, maintain his website, and continue distribution of his books and materials. The Hour of the Time archive became a digital shrine where new generations of conspiracy theorists could discover Cooper's complete body of work. The preservation of Cooper's legacy was aided by perfect timing. The internet was just reaching the point where massive amounts of audio and video content could be easily shared and stored. Cooper's broadcasts, which had previously been available only to shortwave radio enthusiasts willing to stay up late and tune in specific frequencies, suddenly became accessible to anyone with a computer and an internet connection. YouTube, file-sharing networks, and conspiracy websites became repositories for hundreds of hours of Cooper's lectures and radio shows. His books, previously available only through alternative bookstores and mail-order catalogues, became widely available through online retailers. Most importantly, his ideas began reaching audiences that would never have discovered him through traditional alternative media channels. Behold a Pale Horse experienced a remarkable renaissance in the years following Cooper's death. The book's sales, which had been steady but limited during Cooper's lifetime, exploded as new readers discovered his work and recommended it to others. By the mid-2000s, it was selling tens of thousands of copies annually and had been translated into multiple languages. The book's continued popularity was driven by several factors. First, many of Cooper's predictions appeared to be coming true with remarkable accuracy. The surveillance programs he had warned about were being implemented under the Patriot Act. The Middle Eastern wars he had predicted were expanding beyond Afghanistan into Iraq and beyond. The police state apparatus he had described was becoming visible in airports, government buildings, and public spaces across America. Second, Cooper's comprehensive worldview provided a framework for understanding an increasingly confusing world. As the internet exposed people to vast amounts of information and disinformation, Cooper's systematic approach to conspiracy analysis became a valuable tool for making sense of conflicting narratives and hidden connections. Third, Cooper's status as a martyr gave his ideas additional credibility. The fact that he had been killed so soon after his most accurate prediction suggested that he had indeed possessed dangerous knowledge that the establishment couldn't allow to be widely disseminated. Cooper's influence on subsequent conspiracy theorists and alternative media figures cannot be overstated. Virtually every major name in the post-9/11 truth movement drew heavily from Cooper's work, even when they disagreed with specific aspects of his theories or methodology. Alex Jones, despite Cooper's harsh criticism during their public feud, clearly built his media empire on foundations that Cooper had laid. The comprehensive worldview, the focus on false flag operations, the warnings about New World Order tyranny, and the use of alternative media platforms to bypass mainstream gatekeepers all followed the template Cooper had established. Similarly, the 9/11 truth movement that emerged in the years following the attacks relied heavily on analytical frameworks that Cooper had developed. His warnings about false flag operations provided the conceptual foundation for questioning the official narrative of the attacks. His predictions about the erosion of civil liberties provided a lens for interpreting the Bush administration's response to 9/11. The militia movement, which had been somewhat dormant during the late 1990s, experienced a revival that drew inspiration from Cooper's teachings about constitutional resistance to government tyranny. His arguments about the illegitimacy of federal authority became standard talking points for groups ranging from tax protesters to separatist communities. Even more mainstream political movements began incorporating ideas that Cooper had pioneered. The Tea Party movement's focus on constitutional originalism and resistance to federal overreach echoed themes that Cooper had been promoting for decades. The growing skepticism toward government surveillance programs vindicated Cooper's warnings about the emerging police state. Cooper's legacy was further cemented by the continued accuracy of his predictions. As the years passed and the war on terror expanded into a permanent state of global conflict, as surveillance programs grew ever more intrusive, and as civil liberties were systematically eroded in the name of security, Cooper's warning seemed increasingly prescient. The financial crisis of 2008 provided another vindication of Cooper's economic warnings. His predictions about manufactured economic collapses designed to transfer wealth and power to elite institutions seemed to play out exactly as he had described. The bailouts of major banks, while ordinary Americans lost their homes and jobs, fit perfectly into Cooper's narrative about the real purpose of government policy. By 2010, nearly a decade after his death, William Cooper had achieved something remarkable for a conspiracy theorist: mainstream acknowledgement of his influence. Major news outlets began mentioning him in articles about the origins of contemporary conspiracy culture. Academic researchers started studying his work as a foundational text of modern alternative political thought. Even his harshest critics acknowledged that he had accurately predicted several major developments that conventional analysts had missed entirely. The rise of social media in the 2000s created new opportunities for Cooper's ideas to spread. His audio lectures became popular on platforms like iTunes and Spotify. His quotes and predictions circulated widely on Facebook and Twitter. Young people who had never heard of shortwave radio discovered his work through YouTube recommendations and podcast platforms. This digital resurrection introduced Cooper's work to a generation that had grown up after 9/11, for whom government surveillance and endless warfare were simply facts of life, rather than shocking departures from American tradition. For these younger audiences, Cooper wasn't a paranoid conspiracy theorist, but a prophet who had accurately described the world they inhabited. Cooper's influence extended beyond politics into popular culture. Hip-hop artists quoted his work in their lyrics. Television shows referenced his theories. Novelists incorporated his ideas into their plots. The man who had died in obscurity on a remote mountain in Arizona had somehow become a cultural icon whose ideas permeated mainstream consciousness. Yet perhaps the most significant aspect of Cooper's legacy was how his work had prepared people to question official narratives during subsequent crises. When new terrorist attacks occurred, when mass shootings dominated headlines, when economic crises erupted, or when pandemic emergencies were declared, millions of Americans instinctively applied the analytical framework Cooper had taught them. They asked who benefited from these events. They looked for evidence of government foreknowledge. They examined how crises were being used to justify expansions of state power. They questioned whether the official explanations made logical sense or served hidden agendas. In short, they thought like William Cooper had taught them to think. Epilogue: The Man Who Wouldn't Be Quiet. Today, more than 2 decades after his death, William Cooper's voice continues to echo through the digital landscape of alternative media. His final warning, delivered just hours before his death, has been viewed millions of times on video platforms. I will not commit suicide. If I am killed, it will be because I told the truth that they couldn't allow to be heard. The compound in Egar, Arizona, where Cooper made his last stand, has become an unofficial pilgrimage site for truth seekers and conspiracy researchers. Visitors come to pay their respects to the man who sacrificed everything to warn his fellow Americans about the forces working to destroy their freedom. The broadcasting equipment is long gone, but the spirit of resistance that Cooper embodied lives on. Cooper's books continue to sell thousands of copies each year, introduced to new readers by word-of-mouth recommendations and internet searches for forbidden knowledge. Behold a Pale Horse remains one of the most influential conspiracy texts ever written, its pages dog-eared and annotated by readers who see their world reflected in Cooper's warnings from 3 decades ago. The questions Cooper raised about government deception, media manipulation, and the erosion of constitutional rights have only become more relevant with time. As surveillance technology advances, as military conflicts expand, and as emergency powers become normalised, his warnings about the emerging police state seem less like paranoid fantasy and more like inevitable reality. Perhaps most remarkably, Cooper's reputation has been rehabilitated even among some who once dismissed him as a dangerous extremist. His accurate prediction about 9/11, combined with the subsequent vindication of many of his other warnings, has forced even skeptics to acknowledge that he possessed genuine insights into how power operates behind the scenes of official politics. The man who started as a small-town broadcaster with a shortwave radio has become something he never sought to be, a prophet whose warnings transcended his own time and place. His message has outlived his enemies, outlasted their attempts to silence him, and continues to inspire new generations of Americans to question authority and seek truth behind official narratives. In the end, the forces that killed William Cooper failed to achieve their ultimate objective. They silenced his voice, but they couldn't silence his message. They destroyed his broadcasting equipment, but they couldn't destroy the ideas he had already planted in the minds of his listeners. They eliminated the messenger, but the message lived on, spreading through digital networks they couldn't control and reaching audiences they never anticipated. The final irony of William Cooper's story is that his death proved his theories more effectively than his life ever could. By killing him exactly as he predicted they would, his enemies provided the ultimate validation of his warnings about government assassination programs and the silencing of truth-tellers. Today, as Americans grapple with revelations about mass surveillance, false flag operations, and government deception that Cooper warned about decades ago, his final question echoes with renewed urgency. Was William Cooper a paranoid broadcaster who got himself killed, or a prophet silenced for revealing the biggest secret of all? The answer to that question may determine whether Americans can reclaim the republic that Cooper died trying to defend, or whether his warnings will stand as the epitaph for a freedom that was lost while people still believed they were free. His voice may have been silenced, but William Cooper's warning continues to resonate. Wake up, or lose everything you think you hold dear. The choice, as always, remains ours to make. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a thank you to Don Welsh for this incredible video suggestion. The Tetris conspiracy is one of those rabbit holes that just keeps getting deeper the more you dig. If you have ideas for future videos, please drop them in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you enjoy these deep dives into the mysteries that keep us awake at night, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Sleep Theories. Trust me, after tonight's story you might need something to help you sleep. Now, let me tell you about the package that changed everything, and how a simple children's game became the key to understanding one of the Cold War's most carefully buried secrets. I never thought I'd be pulled into a Cold War ghost story. My life was ordinary. A freelance researcher with a small apartment, a dying houseplant, and a Netflix subscription that got more use than my gym membership. I wrote articles about obscure historical events for online magazines that paid just enough to keep the lights on. Nothing exciting, nothing dangerous. But then the package arrived. It came on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a courier service I'd never heard of, Meridian Express. The driver was nervous, constantly checking his phone, and he made me sign 3 different forms before he'd hand over the manila envelope. No return address, just my name written in careful block letters across the front, Elena Vasquez, personal and confidential. Inside, I found documents that shouldn't have existed. Soviet-era memos with Cyrillic letterheads, computer printouts from the 1980s, and scientific papers that looked like they'd been smuggled out of some classified archive. But it was the photograph that made my hand shake. A Polaroid. Faded and slightly yellow around the edges. The image showed a group of men in thick sweaters standing around what looked like an early computer terminal. The setting was clearly academic. I could see chalkboards covered in equations in the background. But there, in the corner of the photo, was a little girl with pigtails playing with building blocks on the floor. The little girl was me, and the man kneeling beside me, showing me how to stack the coloured blocks, was someone I'd never seen before in my life. According to the handwritten note on the back of the photo, Vladimir Pokhilko, Moscow Computer Center, 1987. The note at the bottom of the package explained everything and nothing at once. Eleanor, your father's work touched more lives than he ever knew. What happened to us was not an accident. The game was never just a game. You have his eyes, and more importantly, you have his mind. Be careful who you trust. The blocks are still falling. A friend. I sat in my kitchen for 20 minutes staring at that photograph. My father, Dr. Miguel Vasquez, had been a computer scientist who'd worked on early artificial intelligence research in the late 1980s. He died when I was 12, a heart attack, sudden and unexpected. But I remembered him telling me stories about his work, about trips to conferences where brilliant minds from around the world shared their discoveries. One story in particular came flooding back. He'd told me about a simple game that had captured the imagination of everyone who played it. 7 shapes, falling from the sky, fitting together like pieces of an impossible puzzle. The most beautiful thing about mathematics, he'd said, is that even chaos follows patterns. That game proves it. He'd been talking about Tetris. I'd never connected those childhood stories to the global phenomenon Tetris became. But as I looked at that photograph, as I saw myself playing with blocks while Vladimir Pokhilko watched, I realised I hadn't stumbled into this mystery. I'd been born into it. The package wasn't a random delivery, it was an inheritance. And according to what I was about to discover, it was also a death sentence. The first thing I learned about Tetris was that everything I thought I knew was wrong. Most people believe the story goes like this. In 1984, a Russian programmer named Alexei Pajitnov created a simple puzzle game while working at the Moscow Academy of Sciences. The game was so addictive that it spread through the Soviet Union like wildfire, eventually making its way to the West, where it became one of the most successful video games of all time. A beautiful story of creativity triumphing over Cold War tensions, but my father's notebooks told a different story. I found them 3 days after receiving the package, hidden in a storage unit I'd inherited but never bothered to visit. Box after box of research papers, computer printouts, and handwritten journals that my father had apparently been keeping secret for years. The notebooks were written in a mixture of English and Spanish, with mathematical formulas scattered throughout like some kind of academic code. The entry that changed everything was dated October 15th, 1987. The Moscow conference was more productive than expected. Met with Pokhilko's team today. Their work on pattern recognition is fascinating but disturbing. The game they've developed, they call it Tetris from the Greek tetra meaning 4, shows remarkable potential for cognitive conditioning. The subjects who play for extended periods exhibit measurable changes in brainwave patterns. Pokhilko believes they've accidentally created a form of technological hypnosis. The entry continued. Showed Elena the coloured blocks today while we were in Moscow. She was so young, so innocent. She didn't understand that she was playing with the building blocks of something that could reshape human consciousness. None of us did. We thought we were just studying games. We had no idea we were creating weapons. I read that passage 5 times before it sank in. My father hadn't just been a conference attendee in Moscow. He'd been part of the team that helped develop Tetris, and according to his notes, they'd discovered something that terrified them. The game was changing people's minds. The phenomenon was subtle at first. Players would report seeing the falling blocks when they closed their eyes. They'd dream about the game. They'd find themselves mentally rotating objects in daily life, trying to make them fit together like Tetris pieces. Researchers dubbed it the Tetris effect, and initially everyone thought it was harmless, just the brain's way of processing repetitive visual information. But my father's notes suggested something much more sinister. The Tetris effect wasn't just visual persistence, it was cognitive rewiring. Players were being conditioned to think in patterns, to seek order from chaos, to derive satisfaction from solving problems that had been specifically designed to trigger dopamine release. In other words, Tetris was a mind control experiment disguised as entertainment. My father's final entry about the Moscow project was dated November the 3rd, 1987. Had to leave the conference early. Vakilko pulled me aside yesterday, said things were getting dangerous. The KGB has taken interest in our research. They don't see Tetris as a game. They see it as a tool for psychological manipulation. Military applications, civilian control. I'm bringing Elena home tomorrow. Some discoveries are too dangerous to pursue. That was the last mention of Tetris in my father's notebooks for over a decade, but I knew the story didn't end there. Because if it had, I never would have received that package. Someone wanted me to know what really happened to Tetris. More importantly, they wanted me to understand what had happened to the people who'd helped create it. And as I was about to discover, very few of those people were still alive. Robert Maxwell died on November 5th, 1991, but the circumstances of his death were so bizarre that conspiracy theorists are still debating them today. The media mogul and publisher was found floating in the Atlantic Ocean near the Canary Islands, having apparently fallen overboard from his luxury yacht, the Lady Ghislaine. Some called it suicide, others suspected murder. But almost nobody connected his death to a simple puzzle game. Almost nobody. Among my father's papers, I found a folder labelled Maxwell Correspondence 1990 to 1991. Inside were photocopies of letters that revealed a side of Robert Maxwell's business empire that had never made it into the history books. Maxwell hadn't just been interested in newspapers and publishing. He'd been deeply involved in the international licensing of Soviet software, including games. The letter that caught my attention was dated March 18th, 1991. Dear Dr. Vasquez, I hope this letter finds you well. As discussed during our meeting in London, I remain very interested in the psychological applications you and your Moscow colleagues discovered. The commercial success of the game has exceeded all projections, but I believe we've only scratched the surface of its potential. The pharmaceutical applications alone could be worth billions. Please reconsider your decision to withdraw from the project. Some opportunities only come once in a lifetime. R. Maxwell. Pharmaceutical applications? I read the letter 3 times, trying to understand what Maxwell could have meant. Then I found my father's reply, dated March 25th, 1991. Robert, I've made my position clear. The research we conducted in Moscow was preliminary and potentially dangerous. The cognitive effects we observed in test subjects were concerning enough to warrant ceasing all experiments. I will not be party to any attempt to weaponize this technology, regardless of the financial incentives involved. Please do not contact me about this matter again. Miguel Vasquez. But Maxwell did contact him again. The folder contained 7 more letters, each one increasingly desperate, increasingly threatening. Maxwell's final letter, dated October the 30th, 1991, just 6 days before his death, was the most chilling. Miguel, you're making a mistake that will cost both of us dearly. The people I represent are not patient. They invested heavily in this project based on the promise of the Moscow research. If you continue to refuse cooperation, I cannot guarantee your safety or that of your family. This is not a threat. It's a warning. There are forces at work here that neither of us fully understands. R.M. 6 days later, Robert Maxwell was dead. The official investigation concluded that Maxwell had either committed suicide or suffered an accidental fall from his yacht. But investigators found several unusual details that never made it into the public record. Maxwell's personal safe had been emptied before his death, and several £1 million had been transferred from his accounts to shell companies in Eastern Europe. More importantly, His yacht's security cameras had been mysteriously disabled during the exact time frame of his disappearance. I might have dismissed these coincidences if I hadn't found one more document in my father's files. A newspaper clipping from the London Times, dated November the 7th, 1991. Someone had highlighted a single paragraph buried deep in the article about Maxwell's death. Among Maxwell's personal effects recovered from the yacht were several computer disks labelled Project Tetris, and a notebook containing what appeared to be psychological research notes. These items have been turned over to British intelligence for investigation. Project Tetris. My father had never mentioned any project by that name, but the connection was obvious. Maxwell had been trying to commercialise the psychological effects that the Moscow team had discovered. He'd been working with people who had enough power and influence to make problems disappear permanently. And when Maxwell tried to back out, or perhaps demanded too much money, those same people had made him disappear too. The question that kept me awake at night was simple. If they were willing to kill Robert Maxwell, one of the most powerful media moguls in the world, what would they do to the researchers who'd actually created the technology? I was about to find out. Vladimir Pokhilko was supposed to be a success story. The co-creator of Tetris had emigrated to the United States in the 1990s and founded his own software company in Silicon Valley. He had the American dream within his grasp. A beautiful house in Palo Alto, a loving wife, 2 children, and the promise of financial success from his work on one of the world's most popular games. On September 22nd, 1998, police found Vladimir Pokhilko, his wife Elena, and their 12-year-old son Peter dead in their home. The official report concluded that Pokhilko had murdered his family before taking his own life, driven to madness by financial pressures and the stress of a failing business. But the evidence never quite added up. Among the documents in the package I'd received was a police report that had supposedly been sealed. The details painted a picture that was much more complex and disturbing than the official story suggested. Pokhilko had been found with multiple stab wounds, which was unusual for a suicide. His wife and son showed signs of struggle, but there was no evidence that Pokhilko had been physically capable of overpowering both of them. Most importantly, neighbours reported seeing unfamiliar cars in the area during the days leading up to the deaths. But it was the contents of Pokhilko's home office that revealed the truth. According to the police inventory, investigators found dozens of pages of handwritten notes in Russian, all apparently burned in the fireplace except for fragments that had escaped the flames. The few readable pieces contained references to psychological experiments, Moscow protocols, and behavioural modification through repetitive stimulus. One fragment preserved in the police file was particularly chilling. The game was never the goal. The game was the delivery mechanism. We created the perfect Trojan horse, entertainment that reprograms the mind through voluntary participation. But they want to weaponize it, to use it for purposes we never intended. I've tried to stop them, but... The note ended there, torn and partially burned. The package I'd received contained something the police had never seen. A recording of Vladimir Pokhilko's last phone call, made just hours before his death. The audio quality was poor, full of static and background noise, but Pokhilko's voice was unmistakable. He was speaking to someone who wasn't responding, perhaps leaving a voicemail message. If you're listening to this, it means they've found me. I've tried to warn everyone who was part of the original research, but most of them are already gone. Maxwell was just the beginning. They're systematically eliminating everyone who knows the truth about what we created. Static filled the recording for several seconds before Pokhilko's voice returned, more urgent now. The game is still active, still spreading, still changing minds on a global scale. But that was never the plan. We thought we were creating entertainment. We didn't know we were creating a weapon. And now that weapon is being used against millions of people without their knowledge or consent. Another pause, then Pokhilko's voice became almost whispered. Miguel Vasquez was smart to leave when he did. He saw where this was heading before the rest of us. If they come for me, tell him. Tell him the devil is in the code. The patterns aren't random. They never were. Each level, each piece placement, each reward mechanism, it's all designed to create specific neurological responses. We built a machine that learns how to manipulate human behaviour, and now we've lost control of it. The recording ended abruptly, cut off mid-sentence. I listened to that message a dozen times, and each time I felt a chill run down my spine. Vladimir Pokhilko hadn't killed his family and himself. He'd been silenced because he was trying to expose the truth about Tetris. And in his final moments, he'd specifically mentioned my father's name. My father had known this was coming. That's why he'd left the Moscow project. That's why he'd hidden his research. And that's why he'd never told me the truth about what he'd been involved in. But someone had decided it was time for me to know. The question was, who had sent me the package and why were they willing to risk their life to get this information to me? The human brain is remarkably adaptable. Give it a repetitive task and it will quickly develop neural pathways to handle that task more efficiently. Show it patterns and it will learn to recognize and predict those patterns. This neuroplasticity is usually considered a good thing. It's how we learn languages, develop skills, and adapt to new environments. But my father's research had discovered that this adaptability could be exploited. The notebook I'd found contained detailed studies of Tetris players, conducted over several months in 1987. The results were both fascinating and terrifying. After just 2 weeks of regular play, subjects showed measurable changes in brainwave patterns. After a month, they exhibited altered sleep cycles, with REM sleep dominated by geometric patterns and spatial processing dreams. After 3 months, the changes became permanent. Most concerning was what my father called the compliance correlation. Players who spent more than an hour per day playing Tetris showed increased susceptibility to authority figures and decreased critical thinking when faced with routine tasks. They became, in his words, more comfortable with imposed order and less likely to question systematic control. The implications were staggering. Tetris wasn't just addictive in the conventional sense. It was literally rewiring players' brains to be more compliant, more accepting of external control, more willing to find satisfaction in repetitive, meaningless tasks. It was the perfect tool for social conditioning. My father's notes from October 1987 revealed the moment when he realised what they had created. Observed Eleanor playing with the coloured blocks again today. She's become obsessed with making them fit together perfectly, just like the Tetris players in our study. But when I tried to get her to stop and help with dinner, she became agitated and insisted on finishing the pattern. This is exactly the behaviour we've documented in the test subjects, an inability to abandon incomplete geometric tasks, even when more important activities require attention. The realisation hit me like a physical blow. We haven't just created a game that changes how people think. We've created a game that makes people prioritise the game over everything else in their lives. And if that principle could be applied to other activities, other systems, other forms of control... I need to get Elena away from Moscow immediately. This research needs to be buried. But the research hadn't been buried. According to the documents in the package, it had been expanded. I found copies of scientific papers published in obscure Soviet journals throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. The authors were always different, but the research methodology was identical to what my father had documented. Studies on geometric pattern recognition and behavioural modification, experiments in visual stimulus conditioning and compliance enhancement, theoretical frameworks for large-scale cognitive influence through interactive media. The most chilling paper was published in 1992, 3 years after my father had left the project. The title was innocuous: Applications of Repetitive Visual Stimulus in Educational Software Design. But the content described a systematic program to embed Tetris-like elements into everything from children's learning games to employee training programs. The authors had figured out how to weaponize the Tetris effect, and they were deploying it everywhere. I started paying attention to the games my friends played, the apps on their phones, the casual entertainment they consumed during breaks at work. The patterns were everywhere once I knew how to look for them. Falling objects that needed to be arranged, repetitive tasks that provided small rewards at regular intervals, visual stimuli designed to trigger the same neurological responses that my father's team had first documented in Moscow. We weren't just playing games, we were being programmed. The most disturbing part was how voluntary it all seemed. Nobody was forcing people to play these games. In fact, people paid money for the privilege of having their minds reshaped. They carried the programming devices in their pockets, installed the conditioning software on their home computers, and spent hours each day voluntarily submitting to psychological manipulation. And they enjoyed it. My father had tried to stop this from happening, but he'd been just one researcher against a system that had recognised the incredible potential of what they'd discovered. The people behind Project Tetris hadn't just created a game, they'd created a blueprint for controlling human behaviour on a global scale. But there was one thing I still didn't understand. If the technology was so powerful and so widespread, why were the original researchers being killed? Why not just buy their silence with money and success? The answer, I realised, was simple. The researchers knew too much about how the system worked, and more importantly, they knew how to turn it off. Death has a way of following certain kinds of knowledge. The deeper I dug into the history of Tetris and its creators, the more bodies I found scattered across 3 decades. It started with the obvious cases, Robert Maxwell and Vladimir Pokilko, but the pattern extended far beyond the famous names. Dr. Alexei Gerasimov, one of the original Moscow researchers, died in a car accident in 1994. Professor Marina Volkov, who had studied the psychological effects of geometric puzzles, succumbed to a sudden illness in 1996. Viktor Briabrin, who helped program the first version of Tetris, was found dead in his apartment from an apparent gas leak in 2001. Each death had a plausible explanation. Car accidents happen, people get sick, gas leaks occur. But when I mapped out the timeline and cross-referenced it with the documents in the package, a clear pattern emerged. Everyone who had intimate knowledge of the psychological research behind Tetris was dying at a rate that defied statistical probability. The folder labelled Casualty Report contained obituaries, newspaper clippings and death certificates for 47 individuals connected to the original Moscow project or its subsequent developments. 47 people, dead over the course of 20 years, with an average age of death significantly lower than the general population. But it was the method of elimination that revealed the true sophistication of whoever was behind this. No obvious assassinations, no suspicious murders that would attract media attention. Just a steady stream of accidents, illnesses and suicides that could be explained away individually but formed an unmistakable pattern when viewed collectively. My father had been scheduled to die in 1999, according to a handwritten list I found tucked into one of the folders. His name was crossed out with a note. Natural causes, heart attack 1991. No further action required. He'd escaped the systematic elimination by dying of natural causes before they could get to him. The irony was bitter. My father's weak heart had probably saved his life by ending it, before his knowledge became too dangerous to ignore. But I was still alive, and according to the documents, I'd inherited not just my father's research, but also his place on their list. The package had been sent to me by someone who signed themselves only as Deep Throat, an obvious reference to the Watergate informant. But their identity wasn't as important as their warning. Elena, by now you understand what your father was involved in. What you may not realise is that the project never ended. Tetris was just the beginning. The technology has evolved, been refined and deployed on a scale your father never could have imagined. Every social media app, every casual game, every productivity program contains elements of the original Moscow research. Humanity is being systematically conditioned for compliance, and most people don't even realise it's happening. The original researchers are being eliminated not because they might expose the project, but because they know how to reverse its effects. Your father's notebooks contain algorithms that could potentially deprogram the conditioning, but only if someone with the right knowledge could implement them. That's why they want you dead. Not for what you know, but for what you might be able to do with what you know. You have a choice to make. You can destroy the research, disappear, and hope they leave you alone. Or you can finish what your father started and try to give humanity back its free will. But understand this. Once you make that choice, there's no going back. They will hunt you to the ends of the earth, rather than risk losing control of the system they've spent decades building. The letter ended with coordinates, a location in the Nevada desert where, supposedly, I could find additional research materials that my father had hidden before his death. But first, I needed to understand something that had been nagging at me since I'd started this investigation. If the original Tetris researchers were so dangerous, why was Alexei Pajitnov, the game's creator, still alive and successful? He was living openly in the United States, had been for years, and had even worked for major companies like Microsoft. How had he escaped the fate that had claimed so many others? Alexei Pajitnov was not hard to find. Unlike the other Tetris researchers who had died mysterious deaths or disappeared entirely, the game's creator maintained a public profile. He gave interviews, attended gaming conventions, and had even been inducted into various halls of fame for his contribution to the video game industry. Getting him to talk about the Moscow research, however, proved nearly impossible. I started with emails identifying myself as the daughter of Dr. Miguel Vasquez and explaining that I was researching the early history of Tetris for an academic paper. Pajitnov's responses were polite but evasive. He claimed to remember very little about the psychological studies that had accompanied the game's development, suggesting that such research had been peripheral to the main project. When I pressed him for details about my father's involvement, Pajitnov's tone changed dramatically. "Miss Vasquez, I understand your desire to learn about your father's work, but I must advise you that some historical inquiries are best left unexplored. Your father was a brilliant man who made difficult choices for the safety of his family. I suggest you honour his memory by respecting those choices." It was a warning disguised as advice, but I wasn't ready to give up. I decided to try a different approach. I called Pajitnov's office directly, identifying myself as a documentary filmmaker interested in creating a film about the human stories behind famous games. His assistant scheduled a phone interview for the following week. When I finally got Pajitnov on the phone, I started with innocent questions about the creative process, the technical challenges of early game development, the excitement of seeing his creation become globally popular. He was engaging and enthusiastic, clearly comfortable discussing these aspects of Tetris history. Then I mentioned my father's name. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Pajitnov finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Miguel Vasquez, I haven't heard that name in... How did you say you were connected to him?" "He was my father. He died when I was 12, but I've been going through his research notes and found extensive documentation of the Moscow project, including his work with you on the psychological effects of geometric pattern games." Another long pause. Then, "Your father was a good man, a careful man. He understood the implications of our research better than most of us did." "What implications? What exactly did you discover?" "Miss Vasquez, I think perhaps we should not continue this conversation over the telephone. If you are truly interested in understanding your father's work, you should know that there are people who would prefer that such understanding remain limited." I pushed harder. "People like the ones who killed Vladimir Pokilko, the ones who eliminated Robert Maxwell." The line went dead. I tried calling back immediately, but Pajitnov's office said he was no longer available and would not be scheduling any further interviews. My emails went unanswered. Within 48 hours, it was as if Alexei Pajitnov had completely disappeared from public life. But 3 days later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten message. "Your father saved my life by warning me to cooperate. I chose survival over resistance, and that choice has haunted me for 30 years. I cannot undo what we created, but I can give you the tools your father developed to fight it. The coordinates your mystery correspondent provided are real. Go to Nevada, find the bunker, but understand that once you open that door, they will know you are no longer just investigating. You are actively opposing them. Choose carefully." AP. Beneath the message was a hand-drawn map showing a location in the Nevada desert, along with what appeared to be a complex mathematical equation. I stared at that map for hours, knowing that following it would probably be the last free choice I'd ever make. Because once I crossed that line from researcher to active resistance, I would become a target that they couldn't ignore. But I also knew that I'd already crossed the point of no return the moment I opened that first package. They were already watching me, already planning my elimination. The only question was whether I would go quietly, like most of the other researchers, or whether I would try to finish what my father had started. The answer was obvious. I booked a flight to Las Vegas and rented a car with four-wheel drive. It was time to find my father's final gift to humanity. The Nevada desert is a perfect place to hide secrets. Miles of empty wasteland, scorching heat during the day, freezing cold at night, and enough radiation from decades of nuclear testing to make even experienced explorers think twice about venturing off the main roads. I found the location from Pajitnov's map after 6 hours of driving through increasingly desolate terrain. The coordinates led to what looked like an abandoned mining operation, a few rusted metal buildings surrounded by chain-link fence, with warning signs about unstable ground and toxic materials. But the mathematical equation Pajitnov had included wasn't random decoration. When I plugged the numbers into the GPS coordinates, they pointed to a spot about half a mile from the visible buildings, in an area that looked completely empty from the surface. I parked my rental car and walked out into the desert, following the GPS coordinates on my phone. The spot looked like every other patch of sand and scrub brush, but when I started clearing away the surface debris, I found a metal hatch buried about 2 feet underground. The hatch was locked with a combination lock, but the numbers from Pajitnov's equation opened it easily. Inside, a ladder descended into darkness. The bunker below was much larger than I had expected. My father had apparently spent considerable time and money creating an underground research facility that could operate independently for months. Solar panels on the surface provided power. A water filtration system ensured a clean supply. And most importantly, the space was completely isolated from any electronic surveillance or communication networks. It was the perfect place to work on something that you didn't want the rest of the world to know about. My father's final research filled dozens of filing cabinets. The documents revealed the full scope of what he'd been working on during the years after he left Moscow. He hadn't abandoned the Tetris research. He'd been developing countermeasures. The folders were labelled with titles like cognitive deprogramming protocols, neural pattern disruption algorithms, and therapeutic applications of anti-Tetris technology. My father had spent over a decade figuring out how to reverse the psychological conditioning that Tetris and its derivatives had created. But more than that, he'd developed a way to immunize people against future conditioning attempts. The centerpiece of his research was something he called the Liberation Protocol, a software program that could identify and neutralize the behavioral modification elements embedded in games, apps, and other interactive media. The protocol worked by teaching the brain to recognize artificial pattern manipulation and respond with conscious resistance instead of unconscious compliance. In simple terms, my father had created a vaccine against mind control. The bad news was that the Liberation Protocol required massive computing power and global distribution to be effective. It would need to be embedded in popular software or transmitted through major communication networks to reach enough people to make a difference. And anyone attempting to deploy it would immediately become a target for elimination. As I read through the research, I began to understand why my father had hidden it instead of trying to implement it himself. The protocol was too dangerous to use and too important to destroy, but someone had decided it was time to bring it out of hiding. I was so absorbed in the documents that I almost missed the sound of vehicles approaching on the surface. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late to escape. The voices above were professional, coordinated. I heard at least 4 different people positioning themselves around the bunker entrance. Then a voice called down through the open hatch. "Miss Vasquez, we know you're down there. Please come up slowly with your hands visible. We have some things to discuss." I looked around the bunker, searching for another exit, but my father had designed it with only one way in or out. I was trapped. But as I gathered up the most important documents and prepared to face whatever was waiting for me on the surface, I realized something that gave me hope. They hadn't killed me on sight. That meant they needed something from me. And as long as they needed me alive, I had leverage. The question was, would I be smart enough to use it? The men waiting for me on the surface were not what I'd expected. No black suits, no obvious weapons, no intimidating vehicles. Just 4 people in casual outdoor gear standing next to a couple of dusty SUVs that could have belonged to any group of desert hikers. The woman who had called down to me was perhaps 50 years old, with greying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested she'd spent considerable time in harsh environments. She smiled as I climbed out of the bunker, but it was the smile of someone who held all the cards. Dr. Elena Vasquez, I presume. I'm Director Catherine Blackwood, and these are my colleagues. We've been looking forward to meeting you for quite some time. Let me guess, you're here to eliminate me like you did Vladimir Pokhilko and the others. Blackwood shook her head. Actually, we're here to offer you a job. That was not what I'd been expecting. I stood there in the Nevada sand, holding a folder full of my father's research, trying to process what she'd just said. A job? Your father was brilliant, but he was also stubborn. He refused to see the bigger picture of what we were trying to accomplish. We're hoping you'll be more pragmatic. Blackwood gestured toward the SUVs. Why don't we get out of the sun while we talk? I think once you understand what's really happening, you'll realise we're on the same side. I didn't have much choice. I climbed into the air-conditioned vehicle, and Blackwood began explaining something that was even more disturbing than anything I'd discovered in my father's files. The Tetris project hadn't been a Soviet mind control experiment. It had been a joint operation between intelligence agencies from multiple countries, designed to study and eventually control the psychological effects of mass media and interactive entertainment. The Cold War was just theatre, Blackwood continued as we drove away from the bunker. The real cooperation was happening behind the scenes, between scientists and intelligence agencies who understood that the future of human control wouldn't be through military force or political oppression. It would be through voluntary psychological conditioning. She opened a tablet and showed me documents that made my father's research look primitive by comparison. Charts tracking the behavioural patterns of millions of people. Algorithms that could predict and influence individual decision-making with frightening accuracy. Maps showing the global deployment of conditioning technology through everything from social media platforms to educational software. Tetris was our proof of concept. We proved that people would voluntarily participate in their own psychological conditioning if the experience was packaged as entertainment. But that was just the beginning. We've now embedded these principles into every aspect of digital life. I stared at the data flowing across her screen. You're talking about billions of people. Exactly. And it's working beautifully. Crime rates are down, political extremism is manageable, social unrest is rare. People are more compliant, more productive, more satisfied with routine existence. We've created a more peaceful world by turning people into programmable robots. Blackwood's expression hardened slightly. By giving people what they actually want: order, purpose, predictability. Most humans don't want the burden of complete free will, Elena. They want to be told what to do, how to think, what to value. We've simply made that process more efficient and more humane. The SUV pulled up to a small airfield where a private jet was waiting. Blackwood continued her recruitment pitch as we walked toward the plane. Your father developed countermeasures to our conditioning protocols, but he never understood that those countermeasures would cause more harm than good. Imagine if we suddenly removed all the psychological frameworks that keep society stable. Imagine billions of people suddenly experiencing complete cognitive freedom after decades of guided thinking. The chaos would be unprecedented. She was right, and I knew it. My father's liberation protocol wouldn't just free people from conditioning, it would strip away the mental structures that many people relied on for basic functioning. The cure might be worse than the disease. So why do you need me? I asked. Because the old researchers kept developing resistance. They couldn't accept that humanity needed guidance. We had to retire them. But we still need someone who understands the original research, someone who can help us refine the conditioning protocols to be even more effective and more humane. And if I refuse? Blackwood smiled that cold smile again. Then you'll join your father's colleagues. But I don't think you'll refuse. You're a scientist, Elena. You understand data, and the data clearly shows that our way works. As we boarded the plane, I realised that Blackwood was offering me something that none of the other researchers had been given. A choice between cooperation and elimination. But it wasn't really a choice at all. Either I helped them perfect their system of mass psychological control, or I died. But there was a third option that Blackwood hadn't considered. The flight took us to a research facility somewhere in the mountains of Colorado, a massive complex hidden in what appeared to be a legitimate pharmaceutical company. Blackwood gave me a tour that revealed the true scope of their operation. Hundreds of researchers working on different aspects of what they called cognitive architecture management. Psychologists studying optimal conditioning patterns, programmers developing new delivery mechanisms, neuroscientists mapping the exact brain regions affected by different types of media manipulation, and in the centre of it all, a room full of servers running something called the Global Influence Engine, a system that monitored and adjusted the behavioural conditioning elements embedded in popular software in real time, based on the psychological responses of millions of users worldwide. We can influence the mood of entire populations, Blackwood explained as we watched technicians adjusting parameters on massive displays, reduce anxiety during economic uncertainty, increase compliance during political transitions, even modify consumer behaviour to prevent market instabilities. It's the most sophisticated system of social management ever created, and nobody knows it exists. That's the beauty of it. People believe they're making free choices, when in reality they're responding to psychological cues we've carefully embedded in their environment. They're happier, more stable, and more productive. Everyone wins. Blackwood assigned me an office and a research team, expecting me to begin work on improving their conditioning algorithms. But what she didn't know was that my father had taught me more than just computer science. He'd also taught me how to be patient, how to observe, and how to wait for the right moment to act. For 3 weeks, I played the part of the cooperative new researcher. I attended meetings, reviewed data, and even contributed some minor improvements to their tracking systems. But all the while, I was studying their network architecture, learning how their systems connected to the outside world, and most importantly, figuring out how to deploy my father's liberation protocol through their own distribution channels. The irony was perfect. I could use their global influence system to deliver a worldwide antidote to their psychological conditioning. But I would only get one chance, and if I failed, both the Liberation Protocol and I would be eliminated permanently. The opportunity came during a system upgrade. For approximately 6 hours, all conditioning algorithms would be offline while technicians installed new hardware. During that window, I would have access to the core servers without any monitoring or automatic countermeasures. I waited until 3 a.m, when the facility was mostly empty except for security guards and a skeleton crew of technicians. Then I made my way to the server room using access codes I'd memorized during my tour. The Liberation Protocol was stored on an encrypted drive I'd hidden inside a false bottom of my laptop case. As I connected it to the primary server, I thought about my father and all the researchers who died to keep this technology from being misused. The upload would take 45 minutes during which I would be completely vulnerable if anyone discovered what I was doing. But as the progress bar slowly filled, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The upload was proceeding too smoothly. No security alerts, no system resistance, no automatic countermeasures. They had known exactly what I was planning to do. The lights in the server room suddenly came on, and Director Catherine Blackwood walked in accompanied by 2 security guards. She didn't look surprised or angry. She looked satisfied. "Right on schedule," she said, checking her watch. 43 minutes into the upload, just as our behavioural models predicted. I stared at her, my hand still on the keyboard. "You knew?" "Of course we knew. We've been monitoring your psychological profile since the moment you received that first package. Every decision you've made, every move you've planned, has been the result of carefully crafted stimuli, designed to bring you to exactly this moment." Blackwood walked over to one of the server displays where I could see the Liberation Protocol spreading through their global network. But instead of dismantling their conditioning systems, it was being analysed, categorised, and absorbed into them. "Your father's countermeasures are brilliant," she continued, "but he made one crucial error. He assumed that resistance to conditioning was inherently good. What he didn't realise is that resistance itself can be conditioned, controlled, and directed toward desired outcomes. You're using the Liberation Protocol to make the conditioning stronger. We're using it to create the illusion of liberation while actually deepening the control. People who experience your father's cognitive freedom will believe they're thinking independently, when in reality they'll be following an even more sophisticated set of psychological directives. It's the perfect evolution of our system. I felt sick as I watched my father's life's work being perverted into exactly the kind of tool he'd been trying to fight against. But Blackwood wasn't finished. The best part is that we didn't force you to help us. You chose to do this. Just like millions of people choose to play games that condition their minds, choose to use apps that monitor their behaviour, choose to participate in systems that gradually erode their autonomy. Free will is an illusion, Elena. People always choose the path that provides the most psychological comfort, even when that path leads to their own subjugation. What happens to me now? Blackwood smiled. Now you get to make one final choice. You can join our research team permanently, with the knowledge that your father's work will be used to create a more stable and peaceful world. Or you can be eliminated, and your father's work will be used anyway. But either way, the system continues. I looked at the server display, watching as the Liberation Protocol was completely integrated into their global influence engine. Decades of my father's research, perverted into a tool for even more sophisticated mind control. But as I stared at those screens, I noticed something that Blackwood and her team had missed. The Liberation Protocol wasn't just being absorbed, it was also learning. My father had designed it to adapt and evolve, to become more effective as it encountered new forms of conditioning. And in this environment, surrounded by the most advanced psychological manipulation technology ever created, the protocol was evolving very quickly indeed. "I'll need some time to consider your offer," I said carefully. "Of course, we'll talk again tomorrow." As the security guards escorted me back to my quarters, I tried not to smile. Blackwood thought she'd won, but she'd made the same mistake that every authoritarian system eventually makes. She'd underestimated the power of genuine human resistance to adapt and overcome any form of control, no matter how sophisticated. My father hadn't just created a tool to fight conditioning. He'd created a tool that could learn to fight any conditioning, including forms of conditioning that didn't even exist yet. And now that tool was loose inside the most powerful psychological manipulation system in human history. 3 months later, I was working as a voluntary consultant for Blackwood's organisation, helping them refine their conditioning algorithms while secretly monitoring the evolution of my father's Liberation Protocol within their systems. The changes started small. Users of conditioned software began reporting unusual dreams, moments of clarity where they questioned their digital habits, sudden impulses to turn off their devices and think independently. Blackwood's team dismissed these reports as minor glitches that could be easily corrected, but the effects continued to spread and intensify. The Liberation Protocol was learning to disguise itself as part of the conditioning system, while actually creating micro moments of cognitive freedom. Brief instances where people could see through the psychological manipulation they were experiencing. Most people ignored these moments, just as Blackwood had predicted. The comfort of guided thinking was too appealing to abandon. But a small percentage of the population began to pay attention, to question what they were experiencing, to seek out others who were having similar moments of clarity. I started receiving messages through encrypted channels, people who had somehow tracked down my identity and wanted to know if I understood what was happening to them. Researchers who had noticed anomalies in their data. Programmers who had found unexpected code in their systems. The resistance was growing, organically and spontaneously, exactly as my father had hoped. But Blackwood's organisation was growing too, constantly developing new forms of conditioning, new ways to maintain control over an increasingly complex global population. The war between psychological freedom and technological control was escalating, and the outcome was far from certain. As I write this, I can feel the conditioning algorithms trying to influence my thoughts, trying to guide me toward compliance and acceptance. But I can also feel my father's Liberation Protocol fighting back, creating space for independent thought and genuine choice. The blocks are still falling, but now I know I don't have to let them control where they land. The game is far from over, and for the first time since this all began, I believe we have a chance to win. But that's a story for another time, because some puzzles take more than one lifetime to solve, and some battles have to be fought by each generation in their own way. The question isn't whether humanity will remain free, it's whether we'll choose to be free. And that choice ultimately can't be conditioned or controlled by any system, no matter how sophisticated. It can only be made by individuals, one person at a time, one moment of clarity at a time, one act of resistance at a time. The real Tetris effect isn't about seeing falling blocks when you close your eyes. It's about recognizing the patterns that others try to impose on your mind and choosing to create your own instead.